couple days now, so ARPA budget is a big one. I'm Dr. Marty Leathers, co-chair, the director of the Office of Workforce Development, and it's an honor to be here with everyone today. We want to go ahead and call the meeting to order and start with a safety briefing. So I will yield to the officials from MoDOT for a safety briefing.
Good morning or good afternoon. My name is Becky Almaroth. I'm the Chief Safety and Operations Officer for the Missouri Department of Transportation. Just want to give a few logistics about this building. We aren't anticipating any severe weather today, actually very nice out. But in the event something pops up unexpected, everybody will need to make their way to the very bottom floor, which is 2 floors down from this location. The stairwell is, if you go out to this door over to the left, you'll see the stairwell. In the event of a fire, which is the more likely situation or a medical emergency, those that are on the stage will exit out this door into conference room 101, and there is an exit door that's in that location. Anybody that's in the audience, you'll go out the door, make a left, and come back through the door you probably came into. Just kind of make a U-turn around. Everybody, as you exit the building, proceed up the hill, up Jefferson Street, up to High Street, and we'll kind of gather in that grassy area. Take account of who's to your left and right. Make sure that everybody that you're sitting next to makes it out for the day. And in the event of a medical emergency, we've asked Dana Kaiser to call 911. I have volunteered to administer CPR. Jay Wunderlich will assist me with that. And Linda Horn will grab the AED that is located in the hallway. Thank you and have a great meeting.
Thank you very much for that. And as promised, we have multiplied, we've doubled in the time of the safety briefing. So I appreciate that. I will now yield it back over to Director McKenna to formally kick us off.
Thanks, Dr. Leathers, and I apologize. I guess we'll just call this noon right now. So we got the safety minute in. Look, I'm excited for people to be here and to get this second meeting of the Supply Chain Task Force off the ground. And what I wanted to do first is really let's recognize we didn't have the opportunity because we scheduled so quickly when we got all of our appointments made. We didn't give any of our members any time to plan their own schedules at all. So I wanted to give Mary Lamy, who's our Executive Vice President of Multimodal Enterprises by State Development, terrific partner in the state of Missouri in the St. Louis region. And we're so excited to have Mary as one of the task force members. We're going to learn greatly from her and her experiences, and that's going to really help the task force itself. But I wanted to give Mary an opportunity to introduce herself and to kind of give a little bit of a summary of what she'd like to accomplish in her role on the task force itself and how we can work together to make sure that happens. Mary, so glad you're here with us virtually. Thank you.
Yes, well, good afternoon, and thank you, Director, for that kind introduction.
We're not getting audio. We're checking to see if it's on our end. Not yet. I think it may be on our end, Mary, so if you just bear with us for just a moment. Okay, try again, Mary. Nope.
What about now? Nothing?
Okay, Mary, all yours.
Can you hear me now?
We can.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, very good. All right, well, Director, thank you for that very kind introduction. And again, thank you for the opportunity to be part of this task force. I am an employee of By State Development, and with my role with St. Louis Regional Freightway, we work closely with industry leaders in the manufacturing logistics industries. We spend part of our time focusing on infrastructure investment and the other part partnering with other regions from a marketing perspective. We recognize that whether it's the St. Louis region or the state of Missouri, we are part of the nation's entire supply chain, and we're always looking at ways to see improvements with that. And as far as this task force is concerned, anything that we can do to make a contribution as far as finding ways to improve efficiency and reliability of our freight network, focusing on all modes of transportation. As the director knows, we are working very closely with all the ports up and down the Missouri River. We've just reached out to some of my counterparts in Kansas City this week for ways that we can help support all the efforts for Interstate 70. But really, the emphasis is multimodal transportation and ways that we can not only make the state of Missouri more efficient as far as that flexibility, but also that contribution to the nation as a whole.
Thanks, Mary. You know, when I met Mary several years ago, I think within the first 3 minutes, maybe in the first 30 seconds, she said, "We are jammed up in St. Louis. We need to get the Merchants Bridge done, and we need the I-270 project going." And isn't it nice a few years later that
Oh, yeah.
we are there? And I tell you, it didn't seem like it was even remotely possible at the time. But that's what it takes. It takes a lot of people working together, you know, forwarding those visions. It's a lot of what we're trying to do here at the task force and broaden the message beyond that. But Mary's been a big part of that, getting some of those two most important projects in Missouri for freight, not only just talked about, but actually under construction and underway. So it's been a real productive partnership there. I also wanted to give a little bit of time. I know Todd Spencer has joined us remotely. Appreciate you being with us again. Don't know if you have any quick comments that you'd like to go. Todd, welcome. Good to see you. You know, we had some chips for you again, so we'll send them to you. What?
He's muted.
Okay, I think you're muted.
Okay, I intended to be there today in person. Unfortunately, I had a conflict come up yesterday afternoon. I have another supply chain issue. This one's in Washington, D.C. this afternoon that I have to be here for. But I hope I can contribute meaningfully and in our deliberations. So, without further ado, carry on, sir.
Boy, I think that's a wish that we all have, right? So, meaningful contribution. So, thanks. You know, we also have Chris Gutierrez as well. Has he joined us remotely yet? No, he's not on. He may be with us. We've got a pretty full agenda, but I wanted to stop and open it up for any of the task force members if you have any comments or anything. We've got a bunch of. I'm really pleased to have a bunch of presentations, and very pleased that we have members from the industry that are here to provide feedback to the committee and to the task force. This is going to be vital as we formulate our report, which is the end product for us, and hopefully that report spurs a lot of action to solve a lot of the supply chain issues that we have in Missouri. But Caitlin.
Good morning. I'm Caitlin Murphy. I'm the CEO of Global Gateway Logistics. We are a global freight forwarding company handling and facilitating global ocean, air, ground, and rail transportation.
Dustin?
Good afternoon. My name is Dustin Quisenberry, and I'm the Vice President of Operations for CFI, which is a truckload carrier based in Joplin. We service all 48 states in the U.S. as well as Canada and Mexico, and appreciate the opportunity to be here as well. Thank you.
Terrific. We've got some really good presentations teed up, and we're going to look at commodity flows and network level of service by Katie Kirk from Cambridge Systematics. We're really pleased to have you here. Thanks for being here. We've got regional truck driving by Logan Sheets, Central Transport. Logan, yes. And we've got Tom Crawford Tom's well-known, I think, to all of us in industry here is with the Missouri Trucking Association. Cheryl Ball's gonna talk a little bit about truck parking. We've got Jeff Davis from BNSF Rail, who's going to talk about the economic incentives in the supply chain. And just to forward some of that, one of the things we're tasked to do as a group is to look at what's going on around us and around the nation. And in your packets, we've got some information about what's going on with regard to state legislation that might be relevant in surrounding states. You can see Illinois is awarding additional economic development assistance to private sector developments. We've got several items going on in Kansas where they're establishing maximum length for trains to operate in Kansas, providing for the use and regulation of automated motor vehicles. We've got some items going on in Oklahoma, increasing the legal weight limits for vehicles powered by non-diesel fuel sources. Several others there. There's some federal legislation that's relevant, that's listed. We'll make sure this is up on the website, but we wanted to make this available to the task force. And I know that Jeff Davis will be getting into some of those items as he sees them as well. But unless there are any other items by the members, I'd like to just jump right into the presentations. Does that sound good? So first up, we'll invite Katie Kirk from Cambridge Systematics. Really appreciate you being here. Cambridge has been been working with MoDOT on our state freight and rail plan, and they had agreed to also be providing some support to this task force. We're really appreciative of that effort and excited to hear your presentation on commodity flows and network level of service.
Great.
Katie?
Is this on? Great. Thank you, Patrick, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to be here today. I've been working very closely, as Patrick mentioned, with MoDOT's Multimodal Operations Division with Cheryl and Liz and her team over the past 2 years. Believe it or not, we kicked this off in January 2020 before, things turned a little bit for us, and we're just really excited to be toward the end and really preparing, literally as we speak, the final documentation, which will be ready pretty soon to share with the public and the commission in March. So I'm Katie Kirk. I'm with Cambridge Systematics, and I will get things started. So covering today, and I think looks like the remote is aim in the right spot. Okay, perfect. So as Patrick mentioned, I'll be covering freight commodity flows, performance, and then also trends, which is a little piece at the end that I think that the task force will be interested in, just because it was such a significant part of our effort and really kind of helped set the stage for thinking about the future of freight in Missouri. So stepping back for a moment and sort of talking a little bit about the system from a bird's eye perspective, Missouri's position in the nation lends itself to a very, very robust freight transportation network. There is a robust interstate highway system. Shippers and operators in Missouri have access to 6 of 7 Class I railroads, essentially everybody except for CN. There is a robust ports and waterway system with mileage on both the Mississippi and Missouri rivers. There's 16 public port facilities located along, some of which are very productive. Others are developing and have an immense amount of potential. And in addition to 3 air cargo handling airports, which include St. Louis and Kansas City, which really comprise the lion's share, in addition to Springfield, which is a growing and a very functional facility with a lot of capacity for growth as well. So speaking about the numbers here, to give you a picture about what's happening on the network today, there were 985 million tons of freight transported in all directions and all modes across the network in 2018. That freight was valued at about $1.1 trillion, and it's expected to grow in the future. As part of this freight and rail plan effort, we acquired IHS's TransSearch database, which is a really robust commodity flow database. The base year from 2018 reflects a lot of public and proprietary data sources to really paint a robust picture of what's happening today. And then IHS also provides a sort of midterm and long-term forecast as well, which we looked at as part of this effort. So by 2045, we're expecting that freight to grow from 985 million to 1.1 billion tons, valued at about $1.8 trillion. So that's an increase of about 20% in terms of tonnage and about 60% in terms of value. So It's a significant shift, and, talking about performance, as we will in a couple of moments and a couple of slides, it's really important to understand how that freight is moving and what those hurdles and issues may be, so you can really best plan for the future of freight. Looking at the modes that are utilized, there's a diverse mix, as I talked about up front. There's a lot of different options for shippers and businesses throughout the state. Currently, or I guess for 2018 figures, the most freight was moving, the highest volume of freight in terms of tonnage was moving on the rail network. That's actually pretty unique in terms of states, but really speaks to Missouri's location and just the access to all the different types of Class 1 and short line or local railroads throughout the state. So about 45% of tonnage was moved on the rail network. Not far behind is the trucking system, the highway system. Trucks carried about 41% of freight, with the remainder split between pipeline modes, which comprise about 8%, ports and waterways around 4%, and the air cargo network is not, it's, in terms of the context of the other modes, is not as visible, but it is a very, very important connector, especially when it comes to e-commerce, in terms of moving low volume, high value types of goods. So that's included in there as well, though it's a little bit difficult to see on this slide. By 2045, we are expecting trucks, based on the forecast we looked at, to comprise the highest volume, highest proportion of tonnage, about 47%, with rail still comprising a significant piece as well, around 40%. In terms of value, the shift is a little bit different toward the future. Right now, again, rail is comprising the bulk of that value, but it is expected to level out almost equally between trucks and rail in the future as well. So just giving a sense of what that will look like. And then again, kind of speaking to some of the modes with a little bit less tonnage, air cargo does really move quite a bit of volume, given, especially given sort of the nature of the moves, how it's really just a couple of facilities handling a lot of different parcels, consumer goods, anything really that you would order on Amazon, including other types of high value products that are important.
Katie, can I ask a question, please?
Sure, please do.
Given that I'm the workforce person and not the transportation person, this question might be a little bit, I should probably already know the answer, but I guess my question is you have these projections from 18 to 30 to 45, and right, and it shows that less rail, more on our highway system. And I think about technology, automation, and all these other things that are happening. Really, why is that? Why is it that the trend's going to go the other way and less rail? Is it just that we're going to get more like the rest of the country, or is there some sort of how do we get to that?
We'll talk a little bit about why that is, and some of it has to do with the commodity shifts that we're expecting. Coal, for example, is, when you think about the future, or the history of rail, rather, it's really a lot about coal. It's a major legacy commodity. We're expecting to see some substantial shifts in that market just because of some macroeconomic trends that are shifting in terms of energy uses and sources. So that's a big part of it, because that really is the driver of inbound freight by rail in Missouri today, and not to mention through traffic as well, which we'll talk about in a moment. But some of it has to do with commodities. Other things just have to do with the rising demand in consumer goods. I mean, those types of products don't necessarily lend well to have heavy utilization of the rail network. It often goes in trucks. It's a much more nimble mode that can access a variety of different facilities. So that's a part of it as well. But you're certainly thinking ahead of this presentation, where we will talk a little bit about some of those trends and how we're already starting to see some of those changes shift. But it's a really good question.
Thank you.
Sure, and thank you for interrupting me. I do want to be clear. I think I have probably the longest presentation on the docket today. Please do feel free to interrupt and ask questions. I'm happy to do that. So in terms of directional flows, this is a really important metric to look at from the state's perspective in terms of commodity flow when you're thinking about wear and tear on the roads and the rails and just access in general. It's important to understand what freight is serving Missouri-based businesses and consumers, and what's just simply passing through the state without stopping, using all the same infrastructure but not necessarily contributing economically as much as some of the other freight flows. So Missouri, again, because of its central location in the nation, is very centrally located. It's well positioned to a lot of major markets, including energy markets that I alluded to. Most of the freight moving in the state is moving right through it. About roughly 3/4 of the freight is moving, about 583 million tons in 2018. That being said, when you look at inbound and outbound flows, it's actually quite even. As many of you know, the U.S. is primarily a consumer-based economy. There's a lot coming inbound from locations abroad, from manufacturers abroad. it's heavily skewed in that direction. But the fact that there's just as much inbound freight as outbound freight in a state like Missouri really speaks to the diverse and healthy manufacturing sector. There's a lot of raw materials being produced in Missouri in addition to manufactured goods going outbound to export destinations as well. So it just speaks to the health of the economy. Please, Patrick, go ahead.
Yeah, Katie, this is a really helpful slide. One thing that might be helpful, and I don't know if your data has this and can be sliced this way, but it might be nice to do a stacked bar here where we can see the mode, if you will. How is that inbound, interstate, outbound, and through based on the split between rail, truck, and others? That might be helpful.
I'd be happy to provide that.
Great.
Yeah, in terms of this presentation, I don't have a slide coming up, but I will say that it does reflect some of the figures I'll talk about on the next slide in terms of modal distribution and commodities, and I'll be happy to share that with the committee.
Thank you.
Sure. The valued proportions are very similar. You can see more of a jump in as far as through traffic is concerned in value, and I think a lot of that has to do again with these commodity shifts that we're expecting, kind of decrease in the high bulk, lower value coal type products, and more in the intermodal consumer goods that are expected to move on the network more frequently and in higher volumes by 2045. So we talked about where freight is moving, what it looks like, how it moves, but we haven't talked about what exactly it is too much. And I will say that in 2018, the most dominant commodity moving on Missouri's freight network was non-metallic minerals, which some of you might think, what is that? That's really the aggregates products that we see in the construction sector. Crushed sand, gravel, really, kind of bulk, heavy products that are very well suited to move on barges, on the rail network, and trucks as well. I actually saw a couple trucks carrying grain on my way here today from St. Louis. So it's a very, very robust commodity. It moves both inbound and outbound. And we'll talk about trading partners in a moment, but that is by far the top good. Number two, not far behind, is coal. And as you'll see on the chart, that is expected to drop precipitously by 2045 due to the macroeconomic trends I mentioned earlier. I think that's a really great opportunity for shippers. And in general, it's going to free up a lot of capacity on the rail network nationwide. So even though it does, it is a decline, it is a drop in the goods that we're seeing, it really will free up a lot and provide opportunities for shippers in the future. Other major products in terms of tonnage include agricultural related. So you'll see farm products. Those are kind of the raw materials coming from farms, in addition to food and kindred products, which are more the processing part. So those are in the top 5 as well, in addition to energy products like crude and natural gas. The split by value is a little bit different just because of the nature of these goods, but transportation equipment, that is by far the top valued good today, and it's only expected to increase. And that includes really any type of transportation product, whether it's or equipment type product like a car or an airplane or a rail car, things like that. Missouri has a very robust motor vehicle manufacturing sector, and that really extends to all those types of options there. So highly valuable commodity moving today. Mixed freight just refers to containerized freight. So just, containers coming off of ships, maybe going on a truck or a rail network, but that's really just a kind of a hodgepodge of consumer goods that you would see. Other important products, chemicals, allied products, food, again, processed food products, and then machinery rounds out the top 5. In terms of top trade partners, Illinois is Missouri's #1 trading partner in terms of inbound and outbound freight. It comprises about 17% of total volumes, and it's not surprising. It's right next door. There's a very long shared border there, but it's also a major consumer and producer center as well, much like Missouri, especially in the Chicago region. Currently, Wyoming is a top trading partner as well, and that really just reflects the coal volumes moving by rail. So in the future, I think right now it's listed at second most trading partner. It's going to drop quite a bit by 2045. I think still in the top 10, but a little bit closer to the end there. Whereas what we're expecting to emerge is a little bit more trade with Louisiana, which reflects some of that increased containerized shipping that comes in from international locations and kind of hits at the ports down there and then comes up the network to Missouri. So that's expected to emerge, and again, there's a lot of local trade happening, but also some major states kind of located toward the coasts like Texas and Louisiana. I've been talking mostly about the high-level picture of freight statewide, and that was a nice kind of to set the stage for you. But I did want to give you a couple interesting findings from what we were able to do with the local data, more localized analysis. The Transsearch database is a county-to-county origin-destination database, so there is a lot of detail there. And we were able to do some analysis into like the top freight-generating counties and where that really tends to be concentrated in Missouri. And we found that in Kansas City and St. Louis alone, half of the freight originating and terminating in Missouri takes place in those two metropolitan areas. So Missouri is a big state, and there is a lot going on in the urban areas, but there's also a lot going on in the rural areas as well, and that really just speaks to the drive and the establishments that are situated in the urban areas, and just the importance in terms of the state's economy really is it really is significant when you kind of break it in the county level. The top freight generating county is Jackson County, so that's in the Kansas City metropolitan region. But the next four, St. Louis City, St. Louis County, Jefferson County, and Franklin, those are all within the St. Louis metropolitan area. So just again, underscoring the importance of Missouri's urban areas, but also kind of understanding how that is balanced in the rural regions throughout the state has a lot of implications in terms of understanding freight flows.
Katie, if I might, within that, so when you think of agricultural products in the state, are you seeing in this, we've got obviously a lot of concentration of movement of those agricultural products into St. Louis and Kansas City for then transshipping and moving out beyond. How's that interplay really working? Because you're seeing some interstate as well as interstate, if you will,
Absolutely.
movements of goods. How well do they play with each other in this regard? And where are those kind of pinch points in what you've seen in the data that we can focus on to really take advantage of that?
Yeah, I will say that you mentioned ag specifically. There are data gaps with respect to agriculture products that we're well aware of, and it's because it's such a dynamic way of moving goods. I mean, there's so many micro points in that supply chain that are just very difficult to capture. For example, moving from a barge to a grain elevator, that is often not captured in our data sets, so we don't always get those nuances. But to your point, anytime that goods are moving from a rural part of Missouri to the metropolitan St. Louis and transferring modes, maybe going on a barge, maybe hopping on the rail system, that would be captured in the network, and you can sort of see how those flows take place. But it's being able to understand where the freight is generating specifically also kind of helps tell the story as well. So you can sort of see what's the most likely route. And I'll actually show you on the next slide how we were trying to model that on the highway network, but in the more fixed networks where it's a little bit more evident where the freight flows would be moving, you can kind of, you can speak with stakeholders. We had a robust stakeholder engagement element as part of the freight plan to kind of make sure we understand those nuances. But to your point, it's not always well captured in the data.
Yeah, we frequently see those tensions play out in terms of where the investment dollars go on the road network and otherwise between urban and rural. It's interesting data to confirm what we believe we see out there on the networks every day, is that so much of the flow from rural Missouri ends up moving through Kansas City and St. Louis, that there's a linkage, a very important linkage, that those investments in reliability and capacity in those areas benefit the rural areas as well.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So to what I was preparing for in terms of the corridor level demand, we were able to assign the commodity flows onto the National Highway Network just to get a sense of what it really looks like from a statewide perspective. We can imagine these fixed rail, waterway, air cargo networks a little bit more easily than we can the highways because there's so many shared users. And when we see traffic, we're not necessarily just seeing trucks or vehicles, it's just kind of traffic. So to be able to assign it and really kind of dedicate where these volumes are flowing on the network is just helpful in many ways in terms of planning. And in this exercise, it really underscored the critical importance of the I-44 corridor and the US 60 corridor. Those two corridors together, about 2 billion tons worth of freight were transported in 2018. More so on I-44, I think it was around 1.3 billion tons that year, but these are two extremely significant corridors. And you'll notice US 60 is not the interstate system. That's not where a lot of attention is paid. I think in Missouri, the situation is different because it is such a robust network, but in terms of funding, it can be challenging to secure those dollars for a non-interstate network. And this just goes to show the importance of these routes in supporting Missouri's more rural-based businesses. It's expected that by 2045, I-44 will carry close to 4 billion tons annually. So that is not an insignificant jump, and some of that freight, again, will flow through the state without stopping, but some of it will be supporting local businesses as well. So it's just important to kind of compare those metrics when you're looking at kind of the overall system and the makeup of what's really moving on that roadway, in addition to passenger traffic. So before I move into the level of service discussion, are there any other questions about commodity flows or the data intricacies or nuances that I can answer? Okay, great. So level of service, actually, I'll back up for a second. So level of service is a really important to look at after the exercise of looking at the commodity flows and trying to understand what's currently moving. We like to think that the system can be as efficient as possible and meet the needs of today. But in reality, there are some service level issues, and it is important to identify those. I will say that the highway system, there's a lot more data available readily from MoDOT in addition to other sources. So there's more to look at in terms of congestion, but it's equally as important to put that same focus on multimodal modes as well. So you can really understand, not only how they interact together, but how you can best improve them in the most cost-effective way. So beginning with the highway system, there we go. With the interstate system specifically, there are a couple of reliability metrics that we looked at. One of the most common ones that we would focus on is called truck travel time reliability, or TTTR, which is really a weighted average of trucking congestion throughout the state. The greener the route, the more free-flowing of traffic, and when it gets to be more red, I think you know where I'm going with this, a little bit more congestion. And so in doing this analysis, we found that about 13% of Missouri's interstates were unreliable at any given period. And typically when we see the most unreliability, it's in the PM peak, people leaving schools, people leaving work, not to mention all the commercial vehicles already on the road for the day. So that tends to be the most heavily congested time of day. But just about 13% of interstates are unreliable any period. Most of that mileage is within the urban areas, and I think that's probably not a surprise given what we talked about in terms of freight generation and just the density of residents in that area. It just, leads to conflict in many situations, and it's helpful to kind of be able to isolate this and understand it, because this can really help inform a lot of policy when it comes to deliveries and whether you encourage off-hour deliveries versus during, normal business hours. So it can be helpful to break it down in this way.
Katie, I have a quick question for you.
Sure.
How does that compare with other states? Have we looked at that data of, for instance, in urban interstate areas, we're at 13%. How are other states measured?
That's a great question. I confess I don't know how Missouri ranks, and I think that, again, this is one of many metrics we would look at. Other types of metrics that we have featured in the freight plan include truck speeds, but reliability is really a good one because you don't necessarily want trucks running fast. It's more about whether it's a reliable route to travel on. I'd say it's very. I would say that though the density and the issues in the urban areas is very common, just because of the networks and depending on how freight generators outside of those areas are located. If it happens to be a really dense warehousing corridor, for example, that can lead to areas of congestion outside of the urban core, but I would say it's pretty typical. Yeah. Yeah, we'll absolutely be able to look it up to you. I just don't have it on hand.
Great.
Yeah, I'm happy to share that. On the non-interstate highway side, we can do the same analysis looking at reliability, and we find actually that although there's a little bit more variability than in the urban cores, generally speaking, reliability is still higher in rural areas and lower in urban areas. But that's really just a function or a factor of the function of the roads that we're looking at. So interstate highways are designed for high-moving traffic across long distances, and local roads just simply are not. And depending on which road you're looking at, that can really have a big impact when you're thinking about a truck, a tractor trailer trying to move and access certain roads that aren't necessarily designed for those kinds of vehicles. So that's really where those reliability measures tend to come up. And looking at a specific example, I have St. Louis here. You can kind of see how it comes together in terms of variability. So this chart here shows what it typically looks like in the morning peak midday peak, evening peak, and then weekends. And you can see that even in the weekends, when the interstate system is pretty much open, you still see reliability issues on the non-interstate network just because of those design features I mentioned earlier. And oftentimes trucks are still moving on the weekends. It's not that they're not operating. It really depends on the retailer or the manufacturer, but you still see some delays there, and I think that also speaks to sort of like the trip changes happening for residents as well, kind of those conflicts that come up. So it kind of all comes together, and certainly in the urban areas with these dense networks, it can really pose some challenges in terms of navigating and planning for commercial vehicles. So moving to other modes for a few moments, I know we focused a lot on highways again because there's a lot more data available, but we did a robust analysis for the freight rail specifically as part of the State Freight and Rail Plan, looking at level of service, which in this example, we looked at volume to capacity ratio. And in addition to that, we considered infrastructure elements like number of tracks, yard capacity, the length of siding available, which really helps, staging for rail, track speeds, et cetera. So a couple other factors to sort of refine this map. And you'll see at first glance, it does appear that there are some real areas of concern. Specifically, the Tulsa to Springfield to Memphis route is a pretty congested corridor. But in doing the stakeholder outreach with all of the Class 1 rail carriers and some locals as well, they had a very low concern about level of service. They're frankly not concerned at all. There may be some issues that they're aware of, but it's not hindering their ability to operate in the state and serve their customers, which I think is a great sign, especially given the realities of coal and how that's freeing up additional capacity on the network. It's down about 33% since 2012, and as we talked about, it's only expected to decline in the future as well. So, despite the findings here, we are hearing really good things about that availability of service.
Is this just for intrastate or through, excuse me?
Yeah, it's really the volumes of each segment to the capacity that is expected for it. So it would reflect any type of traffic flow on the network, but really kind of talking segment to segment, what do those volumes look like and what's the actual capacity on the network, plus the infrastructure elements I mentioned earlier.
Hey, Katie, I have a question for you.
Sure.
So out of each of these rail service lanes that exist, just how many of those are shared by multiple providers? Is there like any of them exclusive to like BNSF or some, shared between multiple?
When it comes to the Class 1 carriers, there's not necessarily shared infrastructure. There is switching that occurs, so customers can opt to change carriers. The track is typically owned by the Class 1 system, though, just depending on what route it is. There's sometimes trackage rights with. It sort of depends on the agreement. Sometimes there are trackage rights with like a local or Class 3 carrier that can operate on that certain track, but it's not really kind of a free-for-all in that sense where you can just sort of pick and choose what you want. You typically would enter into a contract or an agreement with a Class 1 carrier and then kind of work from there to determine how to best move your freight. But in terms of shared track, there's also the passenger rail network as well, which does share track on the Missouri River Runner service, and in addition to others throughout the nation. So that also can kind of pose some shared rights and usage agreements as well.
Thank you.
Sure. Moving ahead. Okay, so for the air cargo ports and pipelines, performance here is largely context dependent, and it often depends at the conditions at the facility level. It's a little bit different for the ports and waterways, which I'll get into in a moment because there's other factors at play. But speaking first about air cargo, there is capacity available at all three of Missouri's airports, and they're ready to handle more freight if needed. There is some pretty strong competition in neighboring states. Missouri is a very big state. There's a lot of ground to cover, and there is certainly a market here. But Indianapolis Airport, it's not far from here. O'Hare Airport is 5 hours by truck. Louisville Airport. These are major, nationally significant airports, and they're not too far from Missouri. So it does kind of pose some competition issues with the airports located here. But still, there is capacity and infrastructure available, and we had many conversations with those representatives, and they're ready to handle more freight. What tends to come up more with the airports is really access issues, roadway issues into getting in and out of the facility. And that's true at ports, for ports and pipelines as well. For the Ports and Waterways Network, I have two graphics, including a visual to show you. Two of the biggest issues with respect to performance is flooding and the aging lock and dam infrastructure. And I know Mary probably has a lot to say about this being located in St. Louis. She could probably articulate it much better than I can. But the aging lock and dam infrastructure on the Mississippi River system is a significant hurdle for shippers. Right now, and this chart from the Iowa Department of Transportation really illustrates it well. And if it's difficult to see, on one side, it's the percent delayed vessels, starting kind of at the top of the upper Mississippi and moving all the way down, and Missouri kind of hits halfway toward the bottom there. And then the tonnage also on the other side of the graphic that's moving through each of those locks and dams. And you can see the further down you get, the more delays you start to see, and the older the locks and dams tend to be. This chart is actually a couple years old, so many of them are 100 years old. And one notable issue with the lock and dam network is that many of these locks are undersized, and they can't actually accommodate a standard 15 barge tow. So a standard 15 barge tow trying to pass through one of these locks has to be broken up in pieces before it can pass through. So as you can imagine, that takes a lot of extra time, and it's close to 100% of vessels are delayed because of these types of reasons. So this is a significant hurdle because, as Cheryl talked about a couple weeks ago, there's lots of volumes passing right through the river system all the way down south for export, and vice versa as well. So this is a significant issue, and one that the state of Missouri, as well as other states, don't have a lot of control over. It's a matter of working with the Army Corps and really advocating for funding. But flooding, and to the point of this photo here, is also a major issue. 2019 was a major year for flooding, impacting not only Missouri, but really any state with an inland waterway system, even those that aren't navigable, like I'm thinking about Nebraska, for example. Widespread flooding really wipes out freight flows and can be really difficult to manage. And I should mention, on the Missouri River system, there are no locks and dams. It really is, the water level fluctuates quite a bit, and it's not always reliable in the sense of being able to forward plan in terms of whether it's possible to move freight, depending on those conditions.
Katie,
Sure.
if I might, this slide kind of brings to mind some of the issues. These identify the ones specific to this region, but when you even go a little further beyond this, particularly when you look at lock and dam infrastructure in the country, I think of Sault Ste. Marie. You get a single point of failure that is really fueling the entire U.S. steel industry. Mm-hmm. And that particular lock and dam system there, and I know there have been some progress there, but it's 50 years overdue. Mm-hmm. That could dramatically affect the auto industry in Missouri. Mm-hmm. We looked at that a few years ago, and being shut down for service issues could lead in about 90 days to almost 15,000 jobs affected in Missouri alone. Mm-hmm. And so, we have to remember that all of these are connections to other places, and even being supportive of some of the infrastructure improvements that feed into our systems is really important to consider here.
Absolutely. And with those failure points, the freight is going to find another way to move, whether it's on the roads or the rail system potentially. It's not that it won't happen necessarily. Certainly jobs are an issue, but people are going to see it in other ways, and it's going to be more difficult to manage. So, yeah. And I haven't talked much about pipelines. There's a little bit less that we know about pipelines because they're all 100% privately operated, and many of them you don't even really notice just because of where they are. But access to those terminals and facilities is also important to think about. And there are a couple sites, including the Port of St. Louis, that have pipeline terminals, and just making sure that there's access efficiently to that is an important part of planning for them. Before I move into the trends discussion, are there any other questions about service, comments?
I just wanted to break to make sure that we're giving Mary and Todd an opportunity to ask any questions that they might have.
No, I appreciate all the comments. As mentioned before, I'm definitely interested in some of the data that supports this because of the trends and the comments that we said as far as the decrease in rail.
Great, thanks, Mary. Todd, any? Nope, all set. Okay, thank you.
Great. So I talked a little bit to you about some of the projections we looked at in terms of data, but as we know, you can plan all you want for the future, and you can have a good sense of what's going to happen, but then something like a global pandemic will happen. It will change everything. And I just think to when we kicked off this project in January 2020 and just it was actually virtual, and I can't remember the reasons why it was, but it was sort of, okay, let's get this off. We'll see you in a couple months, and then, sure enough, that didn't quite happen. This is actually our first in-person meeting as part of the whole freight plan. So, while things can happen, and really just being able to sort of not necessarily anticipate the next global pandemic, but just get a sense of sort of the range of possibilities with some of these things coming online that we already know about, and just things that may pop up in the future that, could be related, but, still unexpected. It's just helpful to be thinking about these things in terms of future planning. So we looked at, once this advances, we looked at a number of different trends, and I won't go too much into detail here, except for 3, which I'll cover on the next couple of slides, including e-commerce, nearshoring, and renewable energy. So I'll cover those in a little bit more detail. But we looked at lots of different trends. First going into business and consumer practices. What are some how is demand going to be changing in that regard? What's going to happen with respect to land use and warehousing space? How is the population changing? What happens when you have an aging population with different kinds of consumer needs? What happens when folks start to concentrate a little bit more in urban areas, even more so than they already are, which is a trend we're seeing in lots of states throughout the nation. In terms of workforce and employment, we've talked about Missouri's manufacturing sector. It's very robust, but there are evolving changes in that technology. And so being able to sort of get a sense of training and workforce issues and what's going to be needed to really continue to support those sectors that are so critical to Missouri's economy. Energy and the environment, we've talked a lot about coal today and some of those changing trends, but just kind of getting ahead of other technologies that will come in and other types of infrastructure that's necessary to support some of these renewable and kind of new technologies, electric vehicles, and the lot. Policies and regulations, another big milestone of this project has been the passage of the bipartisan infrastructure law, major federal policy coming in with different kinds of priorities than we haven't seen before. So just sort of getting ahead of that, and then also understanding how that might impact state and local regulations as well. And then, of course, technology, not only changes in the technologies used in the manufacturing sector, but also things like electric vehicles, autonomous vehicles, truck electrification. All these things have impacts on both the state's economy and its transportation network.
Can I ask something on that one?
Sure.
Did you guys also look at or come across data on the economics of transportation for a lot of the stakeholders? So for instance, I know we talk with a lot of stakeholders that are considering actually moving their operations out of Missouri to the coast because it is so difficult for them to book cargo in and out of Missouri on the rail to these export ports because the steamship lines won't allow for it. And so I just wonder how the rising cost of global transportation is factoring into the trends impacting multimodal freight demand in Missouri.
That's a really good question. We didn't quantify the transportation cost specifically. We did quantify the economic value of the freight sector in addition to the freight generating and freight intensive sectors. So we do have numbers on those that we can share as far as contributions are concerned. And we also did an assessment. We use a data set with a bill of lading information, and we sort of wrap that together with our commodity flow database to look a little bit more about corridor costs and the cost of shipping on certain corridors. But I don't have the numbers offhand, and I would love to share with you those findings. I think it was some of the most valuable outputs of this study. Awesome. But it's something that, to your point, in terms of business retention and attraction and investing in the right kinds of modes to support these sectors, it's really important to have understanding there. And yeah, it's going to be really helpful in terms of the recommendations on this task force to hear a little bit more about that from you specifically, Caitlin.
Thank you.
So I would be remiss, next week there is a presentation completely about e-commerce, but I would be remiss if I didn't mention it because it's such an important trend. So I'll talk a little bit about it, but save most of the really good data for next week. But consumer demand, e-commerce in general, freight planners have been talking about for years. It's a trend that's impacting warehousing. It's impacting how goods get to people. But it has really surged since March 2020, and that's because of the state lockdowns, disruptions at ports throughout the world, and just general fear for being out in public. I think some people who had never used Amazon or any kind of e-retailer before discovered the benefits, and then have continued to use it. So we've only seen that demand grow and grow and grow, and it really is showing no signs of letting up. And really, the key to this, the key to doing it and doing it in a way that consumers are now demanding is for those e-retailers to locate as close to the consumers as possible. So proximity to consumers is really important, and that's put a lot of pressure on the warehousing and distribution market. That space is at a premium all over the country and is something, I think a lot of e-retailers are being creative. There's these major facilities like the one in Republic that Governor Parson toured in September. I found a screen grab of that visit. That's a 1.4 million square foot warehouse, if I'm not mistaken. There's major spaces like that, and then on the more urban areas where it's more difficult to find this kind of space, they have what's called micro fulfillment centers, or just kind of smaller centers to kind of meet that demand. So they're getting very creative, and it's changing the way freight is flowing for sure in the state, and it's just kind of important to keep an eye on.
Katie, in the broader study, I'd be curious to think about how much this is coming from our small businesses. So we think about e-commerce is obviously Amazon, and we think about Walmart, we think about the big guys. But so much more we see also from our rural communities and our small businesses in those rural communities. We had the Small Business and Minority-Owned Business Task Force over the summer I was a part of. And what we saw a lot is that created a connection point to many small businesses who realized, you know what, I'm in a small community. People don't come to our community anymore. They're not going to come to my shop, but my candles are really cool, and I can sell them online. Mm-hmm. So, do we, one, know where some of this is originating so we can see the impact rural Missouri is having? And then number two, on the workforce side, what's the impact on, kind of those delivery and light duty? I mean, we think about the FedExes and the UPSs who are then doing a lot of this delivery work to then connect it to the warehouses. So before it even gets to the warehouse, which is a whole problem, thinking about that, does that get into some of this?
I think it certainly does, and I think as far as the data is concerned, I mean, some of these small businesses are, they're going to the local postal office and sending packages to an Amazon facility. Amazon does fulfill a lot of small businesses, and I'm remembering from that particular article them kind of having some stats that I'd be happy to share with the committee because I don't recall offhand. But that's certainly a part of this. I think in the data is a little bit hard to parcel out because it's such small volumes, but certainly it just speaks to the importance of a network that does leverage the USPS and UPS and FedEx, and a lot of that freight is moving on air cargo, just being able to kind of group it in with some of the other parcels that you receive, including e-commerce deliveries. So I think that's where you would see that, but it is a really interesting link and an important one just to make sure that is still able to happen, even if they're not able to leverage a rail car, for example. But it's certainly, e-commerce is a very dynamic industry, and it's one that just keeping our attention on is going to be important, even if you can't necessarily control where the warehouses are happening. Just keeping an eye and sort of understanding how those freight flows is going to be important. So some work that we were able to do in terms of scenario planning and trends and understanding kind of how it might specifically impact freight. And one of the other deliverables for this project, we developed a tool which we call the Missouri Freight Analysis System Tool, or MOFAS. And that tool has a couple different purposes. It's sort of the hub of the freight commodity flow data that I talked about, and actually gives MoDOT the ability to drill down into certain regions and geographies by any kind of MPO boundary or RPC boundary and get a sense of really what's happening locally. It also gives you the option to sort of tweak the forecasts a little bit, either dial it down a little bit or turn it up a little bit in certain ways and kind of see how that might play out on the network. So as an exercise in scenario planning and kind of trying to understand some of these trends a little bit more, we wanted to look at two that we felt would have a particularly strong impact in a state like Missouri. First one being nearshoring. This is just simply moving the productions of goods that are happening overseas and having that be produced more domestically. Not necessarily in Missouri, but could certainly be happening in Missouri as well. But just sort of kind of pulling a little bit back more from the coastal ports and more into sort of the inland networks on the rail and highway system. So we were able to model that shift away from imported goods and towards domestic production. And so in doing that, we were able to see that it would expect by 2045, we'd expect to see a reduction of through-state flows and more of the inbound, outbound, and intrastate flows. And so I do think that speaks to sort of that, more going on in terms of production and industry within the state itself, but then also neighboring states that may already have a market that they can sort of build out in response to some of these nearshoring efforts. It's not only the focus right now of federal policy, there's some R&D dollars actually going into that. that was passed a couple months ago, but also businesses are responding to it because they see the vulnerabilities in their supply chains. If they're leveraging, a certain port across the world or a certain manufacturer or distributor, it really has a major impact on their business. So we're already starting to see this happen even without, policy in place.
Do you see that in terms of trending, that we would need to, if this scenario that we're looking at were to play out and maybe to even accelerate, is that going to put more pressure on maybe the secondary network than if it's not the through traffic, which is really heavily interstate based? Is this going to put more pressure on developing out and making improvements on that secondary network?
We see a very strong need for more intermodal connections. To your point, if it's not just going to go right through without stopping, it's going to need to come off at some point and go either to a manufacturing facility or vice versa, kind of raw materials to market. Absolutely, those linkages, those sort of those transfer points are going to come under more pressure and potentially would need more of them. And so that's one of the key considerations as part of this. We sort of looked at the numbers, but then thought, well, what can Missouri do about it? And so that's actually one of the points that we really strongly recommend if this scenario is really to play out. It's also expected to increase the value and volume of freight moving in the urban areas. And again, there's already a lot going on in Kansas City and St. Louis. This will only further intensify the projections we see there, just because there's already a lot of established business. And if they're manufacturing more products, with the existing infrastructure, it's just going to become more concentrated. And interestingly, we found that both carload and intermodal rail and air cargo volumes would actually increase under this scenario, and truck volumes would slightly decrease. And I think this can come from a couple of different reasons, but sort of the carload rail part, that's the bulk products, that's sort of the inbound, the raw materials coming in to actually manufacture. But then with the intermodal rail and the air cargo, that's that finished product moving. So it's not surprising that we would see more of it, but I think it's really promising that it's well suited for those networks rather than just going back onto the highway system. But other key considerations just based on these findings, in addition to the intermodal connections that I mentioned, just the continued need for modern facilities all across the transportation network, making sure that the roads, rail, ports and waterways, air cargo, all of that is working and functioning, up to as modern as possible. And then workforce training and development to support these potentially new and emerging manufacturing sectors that may not be present in Missouri already or may have had a past and is sort of died out. That's going to be important too, just making sure you can get folks to work in those jobs and produce what needs to be produced here on our land. And the second scenario that we did a similar exercise for was renewable energy. This is a pretty big trend that has a lot of implications. And so for the purpose of this exercise, what we really modeled was a shift down from fossil fuels. So fewer fossil fuels moving across the system and an increase in metals production. And the reason why we did that is because Missouri already has a lot of metals manufacturing going on currently, and it's currently moving on the network. With the shift to electric vehicles and other types of renewable products, batteries become increasingly important. And key components in batteries include metals like lithium, nickel, cobalt. A lot of that already exists here in Missouri. So we see a real opportunity to meet that demand and produce more of these types of batteries. There's actually a lot of R&D currently set up in Missouri as well that's looking into these types of technologies. So it's it's already established, and we would just kind of expect that to kind of ramp up under this scenario. We know a little bit less about whether it would lead to, let's say, more electric vehicles being produced in Missouri. It could just be that the type of car that manufactured is different. So we didn't make any assumptions along those ends, but really just kind of focused on these raw materials. And so after doing this analysis, we were able to see specifically where those volumes of metallic ores might ramp up. And specifically St. Genevieve County, we, based on the assumptions we made, we found that it would increase just the production of metals in that particular county by about 26,000 tons, which equates to about 650 fully loaded trucks per year. I mean, that's even a truck or two a day like that in a rural area with potentially not, roads that aren't designed for that kind of freight volume can have a really big impact. Those are really heavy vehicles, and that can tear up roads pretty quickly if they're not designed appropriately. So just kind of thinking, in terms of numbers, it may seem sort of small from a state perspective, but in the local area, I mean, that has a big impact. And then interestingly enough, this shift would also lead to a decrease in total tonnage statewide, and that's just because you would see a lot less pipeline flows. So you don't necessarily see that even in our day-to-day now, but ultimately it would lead to a decrease in products moving on those modes. And in terms of just things for the state to think about, establishing that network of infrastructure that can support electric vehicles, whether it's truck electrification or anything like that, just sort of thinking about where those investments might make sense, especially to support not only, vehicles here in Missouri, but it's kind of that through traffic too, just being able to support those types of vehicles. Another issue is with respect to the tax collection and just with more trucks not, paying taxes if more of them are electric, and of course this applies to personal vehicles as well, but that does pose a threat to a revenue source for the state. So it's just something to think about in terms of planning for that. And finally, the supply chain to fuel a electric car is very different than it is to fuel a gas-powered car. There's different networks and infrastructure needed, very different commodities involved. And so it's just something to think about, again, in terms of those intermodal connections and just availability of robust infrastructure to support it. So, communicating with stakeholders, communicating with manufacturers, and kind of making sure that we're set up is going to be in the state's best interest. And with that, those are all the slides I have. I know I've had a lot to talk about, and I'm happy to answer any other questions about any of the topics we've covered today. But thank you so much for your time. I'm pleased to be here.
Do we have any questions? Mary, Todd, any?
I was just going to make a comment that I appreciated Katie's comments about the nearshoring and the intermodal connectors. Cheryl Ball's got me on the agenda, I think either next week or the following, to talk about site selector criteria. One of the things that we're looking at is locations that are not developer ready, but seem to meet a lot of the criteria that could help some of these goals for the nearshoring. And we can talk about that a little bit next week, but I appreciate Katie's comments because I think that kind of supports some of these sites that are not developer ready, but they have been vacant, underutilized industrial land that has sat vacant for a number of years. And that's where with this initiative, maybe that'll give us the ability to try and look at some of those challenges and see if we could move the needle on that and get them to developer ready.
Great points.
I just have one comment or question, actually. Thank you again. That was a really robust, comprehensive report, and the data is amazing. In terms of the scenario planning, would the tool be able to run any sort of metrics behind if we implemented a stronger container on vessel mode of transportation and how that would affect and kind of the key considerations then that we could pull out from that? I'm just curious about the tool itself, if it has that capability.
Yeah, we can make adjustments to specific commodities. It's not as interactive as, building a new facility and seeing how it impacts, but sort of ramping up that specific commodity and seeing how it would flow in terms of, mode choice and volumes and all that. That is an aspect of the tool that would be useful for exactly that kind of purpose, just to see kind of what would happen now, and then maybe potentially identify some of those opportunities about where those connectors might need to be built, and thinking about a specific facility locating or something more concrete in that way.
And MoFast, right? MoFast. That's just what MoDOT needed, was one more acronym, because we don't have enough of those already. But no, it is exciting, and that's a great point. Trying to figure out not only what the trends are looking at, but also how to shift the opportunity to meet the basic benefits and already advantages that we have, and take advantage of those in this shifting dynamic. So fantastic presentation. I see Todd is on. Did you have a question there? Yep, his hand is up.
Yes,
I
it
caught
was
that.
up earlier and we didn't notice it and I didn't say anything, so it's fine. But I did enjoy the presentation, and I thought it's appropriate when we talk about planning going forward for the various economic development and things like that. I think one of the things that I certainly would like to see is that there be consideration given to the vehicles, the trucks generally that will be required to load and unload, and the appropriate staging or waiting areas that are going to be needed. In so many instances, we see and hear reports of development that's made with really no consideration made whatsoever. Uh, you know, and some of that, just kind of an illustrative example is I periodically get these pictures of an Amazon warehouse outside Dallas, and the trucks are just forever running down the street. And I'm thinking, guys, there needs to be a better way to do this. And of course, it generally isn't. I mean, it's generally an afterthought, and oftentimes it's an afterthought that really comes too late. And was just curious if there's ways to get those kinds of considerations made earlier in the process. That's all.
I will say that we'll hear a little bit more about that in a few moments from Cheryl Ball. She'll be talking about the truck parking findings that we had as part of the study. That was a separate, it was part of the State Freight and Rail Plan, but it was a separate study where we acquired some truck parking data and really drilled into some of the issues with staging and truck parking on right-of-ways and really kind of finding those hot spots and kind of digging in as much as we could as to why. So we have some information to share with you on that, and it's a really timely and relevant topic. So thank you for bringing it up.
You know, that brings to mind, Todd, a little bit the notion of, you know, impact fees, development impact fees, those types of things. Those are typically driven out of possibility by state legislators all over the country, and as kind of anti-development type of fees. But it's the infrastructure itself. If you don't plan for it, and you don't have a mechanism to pay for those upgrades, you can really modify the reliability of an area, of an entire region very quickly. And with the shifts that are going on with e-commerce and all of the logistical hubs that are building all over the place, I think that's a valid point that we're a little behind the 8 ball on that. So thank you, Todd, for bringing that up.
And yeah, actually, to further on on my comment a minute ago, you know, this is separate from the shortage of truck parking or rest areas overall. These are all things that need to be considered when we're talking about economic development, industrial development, that kinds of things. I mean, they realistically do. You know, parking is one thing, but also impact on traffic and how best to handle it. And certainly we see examples of that, you know, certainly in California and those areas that have basically expanded greatly through the years. And, you know, if we consider these things early on, we're more likely to be happy with the finished product. So thank you.
Great point. Any other questions for Katie?
Yeah, I would just say that one of the points that I found particularly interesting about your presentation was, and really drives to Todd's point, was the commodity shift that happens. And I think the general public probably I certainly didn't realize the amount of coal that transports in and out of the state. And if you think about, you know, that going up to shifting over to truck transportation further in the future, it does highlight the opportunity for us to really think about, again, to Todd's point, there's a lot of challenges today, but then how do we plan and accommodate for that in the future? But again, I think that's something that most people don't realize, and I appreciate you sharing that with us. So good presentation. Thank you.
Not to keep on that bandwagon, but, you know, I think the other thing it makes us think about, and I think about my days, you know, as a county clerk and trying to figure out how we're going to fund county government. And a lot of times we do that with utilities and railroad and the property taxes that are paid each year. And what's going to happen is, as you see this shift occur, if it's going to move away from rail into the roadway, we have to figure out a way to pay for it. At the same time, we have the EV situation where we may be no longer collecting as many dollars through fuel tax as we had before, if we even still have a fuel tax, right? So I think that, you know, that's the other thing I think that this committee needs to think about, so we can help inform the legislator of their options and what happens if they don't make certain choices, you know, between now and 2030, 2035, because just the pay structure alone is going to make a big difference. And so if I'm the Missouri Association of Counties, or if I'm the Missouri Municipal League, I would be really worried about this.
Yeah, I think one of the points, though, is that even with that shift that's projected, that's on a much higher volume. So the volume in both of in multiple modes is going to be higher. It's just the percentage within that is going to be a little lower. But the changing dynamics to the revenue collection at the local and at the state and at the national level are significant to be able to do that. excellent presentation. Thank you for
you.
being here. Really appreciate that. Next up, we've got Logan Sheets from Central Transport to talk about regional truck driving. And Logan, really appreciate you being here.
Well, thank you.
Oh,
So,
I think somebody was signaling to me, and I didn't catch all the signals. I just saw the waving of the hands, but not what that meant. So apologies for that. Welcome.
That's okay. Thank you for having me,
Yep.
and apologies on behalf of Logan. He
Sure.
has a workforce issue. He's got 3 guys out on with COVID, so he's on a truck today. So
You
I'm
know,
here.
kind of highlights the whole issue we're talking about, doesn't it?
Okay.
it really does. And so, if I may, Mr. Chair, Megan Sheets, the better half of Logan Sheets, I had the pleasure, she works in my office. And so she's going to provide a presentation today talking about regional driving, or really the less than load stuff, right? And then we're going to hear from Mr. Crawford in the over-the-road discussion as it relates to Missouri's trucking sector. But, you know, a lot of this is what I talked about at the last task force meeting about how we're seeing the change and the relaxing of standards as it relates to trying to find workers. And then I promise we couldn't have wrote it any better than this because we didn't, but Megan gets to, you know, present on behalf of her husband because they have a workforce shortage today, and he's on a forklift and he's on a truck. So really excited to hear from Megan, and Megan, you'll do great.
So I don't work for Central Transport. I'm a Policy and Grants Associate with OWD, so I actually work in workforce.
So voluntold into this presentation today?
Kind of. I was here for moral support, and then I got voluntold that, hey, he can't be here, so congratulations.
Thank you for doing that for us.
I will try to do him justice, and if I can't answer your questions, I can take them back and I can get you answers.
Thank you.
So Central Transport is a trucking company, and it's located in Michigan. They have 215 terminals across the U.S. They ship to Mexico and Canada. In Missouri, they have 5 terminals. They're located in Columbia, St. Louis, Kansas City, Sikeston, and Springfield. So we're going to be talking about the Columbia location specifically, and the issues that we've kind of seen there. Logan started with the company last year in April. He left a construction logistics company and moved over here. And so this location, when he started, they have 8 driver positions, and he had 4. So he was at 50% capacity, trying to figure out, you know, coming out of the pandemic, or so we thought, how to get drivers and how to retain them. And what he found was the pay scale that Central was offering was not up to par with everybody else. So when he got in there, you know, he did what he could to turn it around. He was able to get the salary increased, so he was able to recruit more people. Right now he is at capacity. He has all 8 of his employees. But some of the things that, while he was trying to hire, he found that they were excluding a lot of candidates because of their tightened requirements. So he was working with them, and then I'm in workforce, so I was like, oh, well, how can I help you? And I kind of did a little research with that as well. We saw what other people were doing and how they were relaxing some of their standards. So what they actually did, so you still have to be 21 years of age. You have to have a valid Class A. You used to have the tanker and hazmat endorsement. They've relaxed it now to where you just have to have your Class A endorsement, and they'll pay for you to get certified in hazmat. You have 90 days to obtain that certification. You had to have 6 months of experience, which is typical across the board. Some people like a year, but they had 6 months. They've relaxed it now to no experience. They will hire directly out of a certified trucking school, as long as you successfully complete it, and then you can get your on-the-job experience. Still, no DWI, DUI, that's relaxed a little bit, and as long as it wasn't within the past 5 years. So with lessening these restrictions, they've been able to open their pool of candidates. And that's helped immensely. There we go. So some of the issues we kind of talked about, difficulty finding qualified candidates with those first standards. The wage increases were a big part of it because they were able to increase it a little bit higher than some of the other averages around the state, and they increased their sign-on bonuses to align with what other people were doing too. They had to make themselves more marketable, and so they did this. They're still having issues with competition because people will come in, they don't have to have experience, so they'll come in for 6 months, get that experience, and then leave for a higher wage position, be that within the industry, the region, or somewhere else.
I feel your pain on that.
Yeah, there's a lot of competition out there. So they've done a lot of things to try and reduce that and make it more lucrative to stay with their company. They have some advancement opportunities within the company, the sign-on bonuses. They have a pretty good benefits package that has actually increased as well. So as Katie was talking about, St. Louis and Kansas City are the hubs. So that's where if you're in one of those places, the wages are higher, you get a higher sign-on bonus, but it's because they have larger terminals and they're needing more people. So currently, across the state, there's 15 open positions for drivers, and then we've got dock worker positions, and that's sorry, I have some notes here. Sorry. The dock worker, so in Columbia, they don't have dock worker positions right now. Their employees do both. They do the dock worker and they do the driving. There's two positions. There's a day shift where everyone's home every night. It's a 7 to 7 type shift. And then they have a 7 p.m. to 7 a shift, and that individual drives back and forth to the hub, to St. Louis. So they drive every night, pick up loads, and bring it back to the facility to be dispersed that next day. So thinking about this and thinking about how the different terminals operate, we're trying to figure out recommendations on how to recruit, how to retain, different things like that. And we see an option of doing kind of an apprenticeship program, having people start as a dock worker at a certain wage while they're going through school. Because what we found is there's not enough schools, not enough certified schools for these individuals, not enough certified schools for these individuals to go through, get the experience they need, get the certifications, and then even CDL testing facilities. There's not enough. People don't have the time or the ability to leave their family for several weeks to learn, to go to school for it. So if we were to increase the certified schools in different locations, people would be able to commute and do both. They could work on the dock, they could learn the company, they could learn the policies, the business, and then go to school still while earning a wage. Our local job centers have funds for training as long as you meet eligibility requirements. And one of the recommendations is for these companies to partner with our local job centers to vet candidates and get them into a job, like day one apprenticeships. So that's kind of the biggest recommendation we have is increase the schools and just where they are located in the state, because like Katie was saying, you know, we've got the urban, the metropolitan hubs, but we don't have a lot of in the rest of the state. So you have to leave to go and get what you need and then come back to get your job. That's it.
Well, Megan, if I could, I would just like to comment, one, you did a fantastic job on such short notice. And I feel like that maybe Logan and you and I have been in a lot of the same meetings here over the last several months, because what I'm hearing you talk about and some of the challenges and the things that Central is working on are a lot of the same things that I know we're working on in our business as well. And, I think it really, what you talked about here, it really highlights the constraints that we feel today on the labor side of the industry. And it's really in what we're experiencing and what I believe I've seen Central do a lot of here is it's really a lot around the edges, right? There's no magical bullet. There's nothing that's going to correct this, but it's really the creativity and trying to understand what are some things that we can do differently. But anyway, you did a fantastic job. Thank you for sharing.
Thank you.
I actually have a question for my co-members and directors. You'll probably know this a little bit more. In terms of Missouri, is there any sort of framework behind an apprenticeship program for any mode of transportation?
So we have a pretty robust program actually for apprenticeships in Missouri, and really it's based on the partners. But we follow the U.S. Department of Labor has what's called a registered apprenticeship model. We follow that. So some states have their own laws that will then kind of set additional standards beyond what the federal government requires. In Missouri, there's really no need for that. We really like and have had a lot of success with, so much so that we've been second in the nation for total apprentices, only to California in the last 3 years. So it works, right? But the idea is we could set these frameworks, and it's a job day one, and then it is an earn and learn model where someone's working towards an end goal or a milestone to where then they have a certification. And it doesn't matter if it's skilled trades or if we're doing it in our hospitals, we have teaching programs and in the trucking sector. The idea is getting people to work and then helping them stay in work by investing in them and cultivating their productive growth. And apprenticeships, the word is stuck with union, but it's not that, right? It's way more than that.
I would just add that is a practice today that we do at CFI, and we actually partner, and we're eligible for grant money where we recruit new drivers into the business, and then we provide their school, and we put them through that, and then we get them the right level of training prior to them going out on their own. So
You have it for material handlers, dock workers, really across the logistics sphere. We look at any sector that's willing and able to invest in their talent. We want to help them do that.
Yeah, and our team in the public sector, our team is trying to do that as well. Our HR team has brought forward a lot of these suggestions. We've got one of the Department of Labor designations with regard to veterans, and trying to incentivize some of our veterans that are coming out of service and trying to bring them into the public sector as well.
Great, thank you.
Great job. Great
It's
job,
like
Nick.
Todd has his hand up again.
Oh, there we go.
I do.
Almost
Thanks
have
for
to make a
noticing.
little noise, Todd, so the screen doesn't pop up like we're not working off the computer. So if you rustle some papers, we'll see you.
I'll throw
And we'll call
something.
on you.
Hey, I thought it was a great presentation, and it sort of Central is a pretty good sized company. I can understand it would be easy. I would think it would be easy to do an apprenticeship program there. Having said that, I also would think that that probably there should be some consideration to actually doing your own driver training program. That way you actually can, you'll be making and the driver training program could be part of the apprenticeship stuff. But the comments about, people staying a while and then leaving, that is just simply so common among people that become attracted to truck driving careers. And I know we're going to talk about this at length here in a little bit, and probably at length for a lot more meetings and for this whole year. But among the problems is the biggest problem with everything about trucking is that we attract plenty of people, we just can't retain them. And retention has got to be the key. And and companies themselves have to actually pony up In some instances, it's money. In some instances, you got to change the work. But whatever it is that causes people to leave, you can't, we've ignored this stuff for years, but you have to focus on it. And, this is certainly something that's been a problem in trucking forever, but, right now it is a problem for employers in every line of work all over the country. And, and, simply finding ways to put new people through the system and put them through quicker, whatever, that doesn't really fix anything. So, we all need to focus on those things that cause people to leave and address those, and we'll keep more of them. Thank you.
I will add, Central does have their own trucking CDL certification. I'm not aware of any in Missouri. That's one of those things that I'm not sure of, but I know they do have one at some of the other states. So they do have that, and so I was just with the terminals that don't have that ability, having one closer and partnering with those job centers will help recruit and get people into the system.
Excellent.
Yeah, Todd, one of the things, of course, we talk about at every state workforce board meeting that you're on is capacity in the training sector. And so ELDT, as we're learning to live with that now, we're going to understand some of the constraints in the short term that it's going to put on, but it is going to produce a safer driver and hopefully also help with retention, because people have to go through those programs are going to be exposed to, hey, I can't just go get a CDL and think this is a good idea. They have to, have a little bit more rigor. What I think the opportunity really is for industry to begin to think about, vertically integrating training and ELDT into their frameworks and not completely outsourcing it, because as you and I talked also many times, not all truck driving programs are created equal. And so often the market is out of line with really what the industry needs. And I think that industry could take a good lead here.
Great, thanks so much for being here, and we appreciate you pinch hitting like that. You did a great job. Next, we have Tom Crawford from the Missouri Trucking Association to discuss over-the-road truck driving. Tom, really appreciate you being here and spending some time with us today. And
thanks for the invite.
yeah, we'll let you take it away.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much for having me. I do have a visitor. I was going to joke I was going to turn it over and let him do the presentation. He's from UPS, Chris Ludig, so they know a little bit about supply chain issues. And there we go. Okay. Thought I'd start off with a little comic strip here that came out late last year, and this was obviously on everybody's mind a little bit when the governor signed the task force document. Folks were worried about what Christmas was going to look like, and quite frankly, so were we in the trucking industry. Looking, kind of doing, I'm going to jump a little bit, but I'm going to try to keep my comments focused a little bit on what this task force can do and some of the areas they can weigh in on. We've heard a little bit around the edges some about what this task force can do, but globally, from a perspective, we're about 1 in 14 jobs in this state in the trucking industry. About 13,000 companies. We do several billion, 8.3 billion. We do about 92% of the manufactured tonnage is transported by truck. And then about 72% of the communities in the state are exclusively served by trucks. We pay a lot in road fees, and one of the kind of points that we like to bring out during the debate, we brought it out a lot last year, was we're about 42% of the tax revenue, but only about 13% of the miles. That number is going to go up with Senate Bill 262 and us not getting refunds. So that number is going to be in excess of 50% pushing in the future. So when you look at our highway user fees, it's over $13,000. That's over and above fuel taxes. That's over and above any other business taxes that are out there. And obviously, MoDOT knows the road miles. These are stole a little bit from your all's data points. So there we go. So as a happenstance, late third quarter last year, early fourth quarter, ATRI, one of our independent research arms, did a survey of the industry, and they have the national results, but these were the results as they related to the Missouri responses. So I've given you the top 10. I'm going to highlight a couple with some slides later on. Driver shortage, the retention issue, as Todd was bringing up, lawsuit abuse reform, driver distraction, driver health and wellness. Number 6 is transportation infrastructure, congestion and funding, detention delay at customer facilities. Marijuana legislation was a big topic here in Missouri, insurance cost and availability, and truck parking. So I'm going to use the next few slides to kind of tap a couple of those with maybe some suggestions of things we can do. Not taking them in any particular order, but jumping into kind of the congestion and bottleneck. Yesterday, ATRI released their top bottlenecks, 1 through 100 in the country. Missouri has 2 of those in Missouri. Number 25 is in St. Louis, I-64 and I-55 corridor at I-44, shocking. And then number 75 is in Kansas City at the I-70 and 670 corridor with US 71. A little bit hard to read, but I think you guys have them in front of me. It's a little bit small on there as well. These are kind of a graphical breakout of the 25 and 75 pulled from that report. And you can go on the ATRI's website and get that report in more detail if you want. Gives you a description and some GIS kind of information. I think Katie had some of this information as well. So I think we use some of the same data points. The difference with ATRI is they have truck GPS data that they have access to. The companies have given them anonymification efforts, so they're able to kind of truck speeds and traffic and congestion. So that's where they pull their data from. Then as you look at the Kansas City, the 670 and I-70, that's Debrick. So what does that mean? And this is a report that they have not updated in a few years, but the 2016 number breaks down the congestion cost and what it means for truck and the vehicle miles. And using the 2016 data, which the 2020 and 2021 data has grown from that, that equates to about 1.2 billion hours. And that means about 425,000 drivers idle for 1 year. That's an unbelievable statistic if you think of how many trucks, the shortage we have, the issues that we have with trying to get drivers, and then to have 500,000 sitting annually. That's a staggering number.
You know, if I might, Tom, on that point, and I really appreciate you bringing out that, because one of the things as we're working through the bipartisan infrastructure law, we're looking at the significance of that in terms of how we can, as a state, designate the investments that are enabled by that law. We did, and I think we should probably put these into the kind of the docket for us. But we're getting guidance from our partners at the national level, of course, and then we're getting further clarification. But one of those things, and many people equate capacity expansion on the roadways with almost equating that exactly to the antithesis of environmental stewardship. But when I see these numbers addressing, you have trucks sitting and they're generating, NO2 and other particulates and things like that.
Not as much as we used to.
No, exactly, exactly. There's been a lot of investment there. But the point is that this is unproductive use, and some reasonable investments can actually free up the freight network. And the unproductive time here and effort is also an environmental issue.
Absolutely.
And so I think I really appreciate, as we're working through at the national level, we're getting clarification. We just got a letter out from the Senate. I believe both the majority and minority leader weighed in on that, saying that states do have the flexibility to determine how those investments are going to be made. And I think that's an important point.
Absolutely.
But thanks for highlighting that.
Thanks for bringing out the word flexibility. We've got some of those issues coming too.
Sure.
The next one I'm moving into is kind of the tort reform, lawsuit abuse kind of area. I won't dwell on that because I think your efforts here are probably limited, but it is a cost driver. It is something at the state, some of our dollars, if you will. In Missouri, we talk about lawsuit abuse, and I know one of my colleagues here in another mode, it's top of their mind as well, because it's a driver for us in Missouri. We're number 3 in the country. A lot of folks kind of don't see it because they're not involved with it, but we're up there when you look at the states: California, New Jersey, Missouri, and then New York's right behind us. Same thing. When you look at the estimated payments versus the size and the percent difference we have, we're up there. We're one of the leaders, and this isn't one of those topics where we want to be a leader on these types of issues. So this one kind of broke down, and it's really difficult to see. But as you look at costs and the marginal cost per mile, and if you want a lot more detailed analysis of operational costs for trucking, this is broken out from ATRI's 2021 report. But you can see the truck insurance premiums line is growing rather quickly, and it's a big part of that lawsuit abuse reform area that's needed. Another area just kind of shows, breaks it out based on size of truck, the insurance premiums, and the out-of-pocket costs per mile by the fleet size. That's one topic. I'm going to switch over now, kind of go into the freight environment. Oh, excuse me, I fast-forwarded too quick there. And I need to get with one of the previous speakers and kind of see where their numbers are a little bit different, because I don't have a slide that shows this, but I had some data that has come out recently, and I don't have a graph put up on it, but she had, let's see, railroads at like 45% of the tonnage and trucks at like 41% of the tonnage, which that number kind of matches up, but it's only a portion of the truck. Our folks at the national level break out rail with the carload and intermodal, and then with truck, we have that broken into 3 categories. The truckload, which is, our numbers kind of match up with what she related for trucks, but that's just the truckload. Then there's also the LTL, which is a percentage of that. And then the private carrier trucks, which is a huge percentage. It's about a third. So if you put all of those in the trucking, because in our opinion, in our view of it, they're all on the road, they're all on the highway. Those numbers break down to 73% and 12% based on 2020 numbers of tonnage. And as you look forward to 2032 tonnage, we're at 71. We slip a little bit. Rail slips a little bit. Other modes are kind of coming in there and getting a little more. But we're all growing. And I think that's the part that this group should be concerned about and looking forward to, is that all modes are going to be growing. The numbers and the shifts between them, we saw the near shoring. I kind of find that hard to believe that you're not going to have more trucks if you're bringing more stuff in the state. There's got to be. So I think that's where that private carrier aspect would be. It would be a company hauling their own good point to point to a different facility for more further processing or retail distribution.
Yeah, I think that'd be very useful to get together and share the data so that we can
I think that would
kind of
be good.
agree on that
Yeah.
data set. That's
Absolutely.
an important consideration.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Tom, would that include also, ag, right? So private carriers are also farmers.
Private carriers, absolutely. Yes,
And
sir.
so I think that it's important to understand which companies are, again, moving their own goods and services. But in
absolutely.
Missouri, ag is a big deal.
Big deal.
And that's
Big deal.
Thank you.
Yep. But I think from our numbers, the ones that our folks are looking at and analyzing the data off of, those come in as trucks, because that's how they're getting to market.
So I'm sorry. So
yeah.
that's truckload, not private carrier?
Truckload, LTL, and private carrier. There's
Right.
3 components
Right.
when we
So
break it up. Yeah.
is that, would ag, the farmers, would they fall under private carrier?
They would fall under private.
Okay, that's what was my point.
Yeah,
Thank
yeah,
you.
exactly. When you look at the freight environment, and I lifted this from one of our carrier members and threw in some data points as I get it from across our membership base. The highlight from this slide kind of sets up the highlights coming up with the driver shortage issue. Multiple carriers, the line down there talking about how strong demand is, multiple carriers are turning down loads, and the number is mind-boggling when you look at 3,000 to 20,000 loads per week that are being turned down by carriers because they just don't have the capacity to haul them. Currently, there's about 6 loads available to every one piece of van that's available. And obviously, everybody knows, Todd can speak to this as well, all of the costs continue to rise. If you're ordering a truck today, you're not getting it till 2024. So moving over to the driver environment, that kind of feeds a little bit off of that. And this is where Todd's group and our group differ a little bit, but in his point about retention is rightfully so in there. But the growth of the industry, and I think the freight that's coming leads us to some of these descriptions. Yes, we need to do better about retention. Yes, we need to do better about recruiting. But the volume of stuff coming is going to create a shortage of about 80,000 that's going to continue to grow over the years in trucking. We put a little bit more in the details on that, but I'm just going to kind of go through. These are just a
Can
few
I ask
more
one more
graphs.
question?
Yes,
Sorry.
sir.
I'm asking this question on purpose.
Yeah.
How much of this is Chicken Little and how much of this is real? If we're going to create, autonomous driving trucks and all this is going to be here, then why would we spend any of our money investing in, helping more truck drivers go to school and go to work?
Who do you want driving that truck other than somebody knows what they're doing? I get your question, and I think about that every day too. And that's a concern of a lot of folks that are out there. But in the context of adoption of that technology, we're a ways away. You're going to have modes and distribution centers that adopt it, and I don't know if they'll be in Missouri. I mean, that's part of the thing we're working over across the street to change some of the laws that are on the books. But I think when and if it's available, some of the good work that MoDOT's doing to create some to fix some of the capacity issues that they have, we're going to continue to push truck-only lanes. That was an idea about 10 years ago that kind of died away with some of the fuel tax increases, the tax increase efforts that came apart. Our group is all in on trying to have that resurrected because we're looking at the same volumes. The discussion at that point was just about I-70. I-44, as you saw earlier, is another point. More points down along the way. Truck-only lanes helps us with that in the future, and it prevents some issues like we saw on I-95. Those don't exist. Those don't happen if you have some truck-only lane capacities. So,
I appreciate that because I think
Yeah.
sometimes we often, even now in the discussions we're having, we want to make investments to solve some of the challenges we have today. But I think some may feel like, well, we're solving a problem that's going to take care of itself, and I would argue we are not going to take care of that problem anytime soon, and we need to continue to invest.
one of the things that came up during our I just got out of an exec committee discussion with our board of directors, and one of the items that came up for discussion was we needed 3 lanes each direction 10 years ago. And with all due respect, they were fighting for it, we were fighting for it, a lot of folks were fighting for several different fuel tax increases or whatever the mode was at the time. We were trying to get more funding to MoDOT. We kicked that can so far down the road that the next jump is a bigger jump. And I think MoDOT's been telling everybody that for a long time about the need to not just redo I-70, you've got to tear it down and build it back up because it's so decimated in its base. You've got to have a better foundation and a bigger stretch to be able to handle the future loads that are coming.
Yeah, and yet in a $1.2 trillion federal bill, only 11% of that bill was for the core road and bridge network. So, the scale of the issue is a problem, and Dr. Leathers, to your point, a lot of people think we can leapfrog 20 years in advance. We actually have to live through from now to there. And, this is going to be an incremental activity in where we can come together and agree on what the most strategic investments are. That's what's really going to help. Thank you.
The bottom graph kind of gives you a little bit of a sample of the different reasons and why people are leaving before retirement, as retirement, and all those kinds of things. So that is a little bit more of a deeper dive, if you will, into the driver shortage, the numbers needed, and then some of the reasons behind it. Along the driver shortage issue, one of the things that we've been pushing, and I apologize, the background of the screen should not have Atris by Atri on it. It just, my bad, bringing over the baseline stuff. Atri did not have a part in this. But this is a program that's been going on in Missouri, had been going on for quite some time, that kind of got stopped with some recent changes and some concerns. And it has to do with a carrier that had a recruiting population based out of Puerto Rico. And for various changes in the CDL requirements and some of the residency requirements that Department of Revenue kind of put in place, that program basically got ground to a halt. We've been trying for about 3 years to resurrect it. We're hopeful that it's going to be starting in the near future. But this is kind of the impact of some of those, like the previous speaker said, trying to find a good pool, a good solution for needing continual driver population to come in. This is a program that started out and was very successful, put about 400 drivers on the road that were very successful, helped contribute to the revenue of the company and to the state. Another pitch for that program is this program is already out there. It's already been approved by the feds. And so for the state looking at, kind of risk, if you will, these carriers have the opportunity to become a Beak 1 carrier. What does that mean? That means they can just bring in folks from Mexico. They don't have to have a CDL license in the United States or in the States. So from a look at the rules they have to follow, the things they have to do, you have a driver come in from Mexico, drop off a load in the States, pick up a load in the States, and go back to Mexico. Done deal. Already approved by the feds. Why can't we have Puerto Ricans come in and work for a company in the States to do this? So, couple of final here. One of the issues, and I think Todd will probably agree with me on this, we watched with interest one of the efforts last fall by the department, by the Highway Patrol, and by the towing industry, kind of sign an agreement to kind of look at quick clearance and some of the efforts that go on there. That is an issue, and it's I'll just say it, it's a growing concern of our industry. More and more are getting hit with this, and it has to deal with non-consensual towing. And this isn't the towing that the company has something happen, they call their tow company to come clear it, and are complaining about the bill. Those are on us. We deal with those on our own. These are the issues because of these types of agreements where roadside enforcement, usually in the form of a highway patrolman or local law enforcement, call the tow truck, and then we're stuck with the bill. And the bill is not been vetted, it's not been run by anything. The towing companies believe that it's just free money because the state, the feds, the whomever called them out, and they get to charge whatever. We're stuck trying to clean that up. Todd's members, OOIDA's members have a big issue with that. A lot of our members have an issue with this, and it's something that's growing. We'd like to see something done on that. We've had several of those items get to the governor's desk and have them vetoed. And our folks we have case after case after case of that. And I'd like this group to kind of take a look at something that can be done to fix that problem. We've been told all along that the state didn't have a role in that, but this document kind of proves that the state does have some sort of role in those documents and those agreements. The final item is just to kind of reiterate our support as an industry, as an association, for infrastructure investment. The other item, I heard a question earlier, was about Senate Bill, is about alternative fuels and electric vehicles and kind of where that's going. And I will say that that's one of the items that a couple of us that were supporting Senate Bill 262 were pushing for to be included was, let's take a look at that, because the current system for charges for electric vehicles is not sufficient for the future. And so part of the statutory framework that was put into place with 262 that's not in the bill to remove, but I heard somebody ask to throw it in to remove, so we've got to fight that too. We want to continue those efforts. We're on the front side of that, we believe, because the adoption right now is not widespread. But to the points earlier, once my industry hits it, MoDOT's in trouble. I mean, if we're 50% of the funding and we go to electric, we're in trouble in the state unless we figure that out. So, finally, I just thought this was funny, so I thought I'd throw that up, and thank you all. We got folks that are protesting road repairs now, that's awesome. So, anyway, with
That's-
that, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
That's my life.
Exactly.
Really good points, Tom, and you know, there are challenges across the board. I think the interesting point on trying to deal with what the revenue mechanism will be as electrification takes hold. We've got a new formula program at the federal level that is putting $7.5 billion into play to encourage you know, nationwide network of this electric fueling stations. But you know, without a mechanism that develops early on, what will happen is it will be viewed as we're taking something
Yes.
where the point of the electrification is not necessarily to stop investing in the infrastructure to move things around. It's to be a little lighter on the environment while we're doing it. And I happen to believe that we ought to be looking at, and 262, as you mentioned, did create a task force to be looking at this. That hasn't kicked off yet. But I believe that there's some way to work in a stranded fee on the electricity that's used on a fuel equivalency basis, so that we're essentially at par. So we don't necessarily have to use that to increase, but let's transition so that it's not a loss and essentially a chaotic issue, because we'll be in electric vehicles stuck in traffic versus in, you know, and then maybe,
Dying.
Maybe not being able
out of
to.
battery.
You still have to push them where you're going, right? So it's an important consideration, and it's here and it's now.
Yes.
And it doesn't have to be something that we have to get to a certain penetration of electric vehicles before we can figure that out. VMT is being considered. There are some pros and cons to that, but a lot of the cons are that people don't realize that the way we collect fuel taxes now is at the wholesale distributor level. There are 1,000 of those locations, and now we have to get collection points from 320 million drivers. There's some complexity to VMT. I think there's some simplicity to looking at it from, you know, collect at that, and it might even not be at the retail location for the pump, but again, back it up to the wholesale level so that that stranded rate affects the utility rate, and we can make the collections and go forward. A lot of discussion there. I appreciate your presentation. I appreciate your work on behalf of your industry, moving a lot of freight in this state, and all the economic benefits that come from that. And I appreciate the fact that you know, you're willing to bring these issues forward, whether we're all the way there on them or not. This is what this task force was for. So thank you for bringing up things like the towing issue and those. It's important consideration. Any other questions for Mr. Crowell?
Before we move on,
Oh, thank you.
remember I
There we
get to. Hey, I agree with much of what Tom said. I do want to basically sort of restate or reassert. You know, if I were there in person, I'd be waving around newspaper articles right now, going back to the 1980s, where we've talked about this mythical driver shortage. You know, the numbers indicate there's no shortage. I mean, Missouri's numbers, AMVA's numbers, over 400,000 new CDLs issued every year. Where do all these folks go? We don't know, but they don't stay in trucking, and basically they don't stay in trucking for lots of reasons. You know, and certainly the state can't address all of these, but you know, the lifestyle issues, things like places to park, the state can play a role in that, and I would hope that doesn't get overlooked. It should have been a priority in the highway bill that Congress passed specifically, but there's nothing in the federal legislation. There's no disincentives or no reason that states can't move ahead in addressing the parking issues that drivers have, and I certainly would like to see Missouri lead the country in doing that.
If I
Thank you.
may, thank you, Todd. And I know Mr. Excuse me, Mr. Matusik of your office is working with us, and I anticipate shortly having a letter going to Mr. McKenna on that exact issue, encouraging Missouri to kind of be a little more proactive on reaching out to some funding for truck parking. So thank you for your all's efforts and working with us on that, because that is an important issue.
Sure. Thank you.
That's a nice segue. We're just about to talk about truck parking.
Thanks for having me, and thanks for continuing to stick your neck out even though folks are wanting it chopped off. I appreciate you. I appreciate
I
you
hadn't
sticking it out
noticed.
there.
What are you hearing? I hadn't noticed anything.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
I had a really
Thank you,
quick
Tom.
question before
Sure,
we went
please.
on. Is the state or MoDOT doing anything to, when we talk about driver shortages, I think about also the diversity or the lack of diversity in the driver pool. Is there any sort of marketing or development being done to really kind of make that better known to women that might want to get into the trucking industry? I think as of right now, the latest statistic was like 10% of overall drivers are female.
Right.
Is anything being done in Missouri to really kind of make that a much higher percentage and explain the industry and the opportunity of truck driving to women?
I don't know that from the state's perspective, they're targeting gender on that, but I know from individual members among my association, that is a driving force. And you have several, I'm not sure about Mr. Quisenberry's company, I'm sure that they're reaching out and they have some female drivers that they're using to help attract more female drivers. I know one of the pushes among the industry is we talk about truck parking, you talk about a lot of things. When we do have those issues kind of being looked at, they're looked at from a restroom or whatever facility. It's a little different.
Yeah.
When you're pulling in more female population. And so reaching out to the truck stops to make them more female friendly and other friendly to everyone that's in our industry. We have a lot coming from different backgrounds and different religions, and putting a chapel out, not everybody's a chapel. So just kind of being as inclusive as we can be to help the population as it's shifting away from being dominated for so long by just one gender, one religion, one whatever, to being more inclusive of everybody that's wanting to come into the industry.
Yeah, I know the Women in Trucking Association is a really big advocate on at least bringing forth the voices of female truckers and what they would prefer in truck parking and in facilities and infrastructure. So definitely something if we're not already going to be discussing it in this, in the future meetings, we should take a look at it.
I'd like that, and if you've got a good contact, maybe we could bring somebody in
we can help
from
you
that
contact
associate.
that,
That'd be terrific. And Mary's not only posting it electronically, but waving, so thank you, Mary.
Hey, I was going to mention the comment regarding Caitlin's question, and that is, and Dr. Marty Leathers can probably build upon this, but we're actually in the process as a region trying to apply for a grant that is going to help us with CDL truck driver training. But part of that grant is going to include the development part and how we can work with a greater percent of our population, whether it's women and minorities, with upskilling and just trying to do a better job to reach out to some of those groups that really are underutilized. And in some cases, they're just not aware of this career opportunity, or maybe they just need a little bit more help to be eligible to go ahead and apply and go through the training. So I think in the major metropolitan areas, there's a concerted effort as far as how we can do better in that. And then I think the other opportunity is with incumbent training. So we may have women and minorities who are in those frontline positions at a lot of the companies that we've talked about today. And that's where, is there any way we could try and introduce them to the trucking industry as a frontline employee and offer them those training opportunities? So we're trying to do some creative things. And we're hoping that, over the next couple of weeks as we apply for these grants, we can we've got existing programs to help us out with our workforce development. We just want to see if we can invest some more time and effort so we can see those numbers come up.
That's great, Mary.
Yeah, Mary, I appreciate you saying that. You know, that is the focus. Certainly, our priorities as we think about the workforce, you know, all the way out to 2030, you know, we're measuring ourselves, like I said last time, from census to census. Part of it is looking through an equity lens, but for us, it's about access and awareness. Those are the two things, right? And it doesn't matter what, you know, what we're trying to accomplish. If we understand how to increase access and awareness, then whether it's the trucking sector or whether it's welding or whether it's, you know, even our teacher shortage, we know we can pull more people in. And that's what we want to be able to do, to be more reflective of our general population. And frankly, we need everyone we can find. So why are we doing anything to maybe has done a lot, just in my experience, since I've been involved in the industry since about 05, quite a bit. And I think it has a ways to go, but it's getting there.
In the context of a comment, if I could, I know we had a few carriers in our industry that were a little bit more progressive in reaching out and trying to bring in the female population. And ironically, were stymied by our government litigating the fact that they didn't have enough female trainers. So trying to improve the population and bring more folks in cost them and shut down that program because they didn't have the balance they needed to start the program. So as we look at bringing more in and looking at things like that, I would ask on the government side, if they could, give some flexibility into trying to bring those things to life. They're not going to look like a program that had been up for 20 years when you're trying to start another portion of it, and you miss the numbers, kind of the Title IX kinds of discussions, as you're trying to bring something along, and that onerous effort by the federal trial attorney, EEOC, led to that issue with one of our carriers in the state. So we need to be aware of those hurdles that government put up as we try to break into this and create a better, more reflective workforce.
Great.
So, thank you.
Good points. Yeah. Thanks so much, Mr. Crawford. Really appreciate your being here. Next, we're going to shift over to Cheryl Ball with MoDOT, and she's going to bring up some of our truck parking information.
Maybe.
Maybe.
Okay, yeah, I'm trying here really hard.
And I'm going to try to look at the screen a little more, and when Todd and Mary are.
I can see their hands doing this from where I was at.
Okay.
I just a few points before I actually talk about truck parking. One is the Women in Trucking. Caitlin, you have to know that as part of our project, we partnered with Scott Gruneth, who is with one of the specialized parking groups. He has a weekly or bi-weekly phone call with truckers all over the country, and including one of the leadership, president of the Women in Trucking. And so he connected her into that. So we've had the opportunity to have that conversation with her to get some viewpoints of what is it we should be looking for in truck parking. So it was specifically related to that. So we have fortunately reached out to that, and the MoFast tool that you both were speaking about earlier is part of this project, and we're in the process of also creating the access point, because we do so much work with our planning partners, and we are so decentralized in decision making as a DOT. Our regional planning commissions like East West Gateway, MARC, and the MPOs will also have access to that tool. So we are providing that as an input for them as well. So you'll be able to play a lot of what ifs through Mary and East West Gateway in addition to us. So I just wanted to follow up on those two pieces. So other than that, good afternoon. Thank you for having me again. Some of the points that I'm speaking, you all have already talked about them, which is great because it tells me I'm on the right track. But I want to put a few points onto that our supply chain, as we know, everything we buy comes on a truck at some point. Trucking is a huge industry. It's a huge issue for all supply chains, and it is the one that you hear most members of the public, they are the most visible part of the supply chain, whether people are cheering them or hating them, depending on where you are on the road. It could go either way, but they are the most visible part, and these trucks need safe, reliable places to park. And this came to a head a few years ago. The trucking industry's been speaking about it for years, but what you saw was, what's passage now was a tragedy that resulted in Jason's Law, which said we have to, as a nation, do better. We have to provide that safe locations where truckers can park and not feel they're going to be murdered and their cargo stolen in the middle of the night while they're just trying to sleep to take their stuff into place. So why is this a public issue, though? Because we get a lot of comments, and I sit on several groups that are multi-state, and each state takes a little different stance on this across the board. When they ask, why does a DOT want to do this? What we have as an agency kind of adopted, why are we interested in this? This is about safety. It is about not only drivers' safety from the truck drivers, but drivers of passenger vehicles on the road. Whenever you have tired drivers, commercial motor vehicle drivers, that is not a safe thing. They are a huge truck. Truck versus car is never good for the car. You never win. So it's about safety. It's about maintaining our infrastructure, because if we don't have a supply within the state of good truck parking that's safe and reliable and set up for them, they park on infrastructure, they have to stop. So we find them on our ramps. We find them, they're looking for good locations to park, and our shoulders and ramps, frankly, are not built to have that type of traffic, and it's not safe for folks to do. So that's why we, as a DOT, care. There are 5 different types of truck parking and challenges of why people are looking for this. And this goes a little to what Todd was saying earlier. He kept saying this is not truck parking. Actually, we are trying to incorporate that it is. There's the long haul that many of us are familiar with that has, they're looking to park, they're resting along the way, there's hours of service limitations, so they're looking to do that. But that staging parking is the one that really has not been addressed well anywhere in the country. And that is truck parking that our drivers are waiting for their appointment time to get in and deliver. They are the ones where the truck parking is, overnight parking is enough outside of the suburban areas, and their drop-off is actually somewhere downtown, and they're trying to get somewhere and stop and wait to avoid rush hour traffic. So it's those intermediate things. Mary Lamy and I worked on some projects a few years ago where we were trying to figure out if there was places that were former shopping malls that had big pavements and areas. Could we locate that? And one of our partners, Mid-America Freight Coalition, actually had some GIS work they did with us, trying to use maps to say this might be a good location because it's got a lot of parking, it's vacant, and it's close to some industrial areas, trying to find a way to maybe marry those two to get some staged parking out of some undeveloped or unused developed property that was already in existence.
Hey, Cheryl.
Yeah.
If I could comment real quick. You know,
Sure.
one of the things that I would add to this is excellent context, that, you know, we oftentimes talk about what can we do from an infrastructure standpoint to support a lot of these things. And what we're seeing a lot of our colleagues in the truckload industry do, including ourselves, is that we're really trying to go back to customers and shippers and then educate them on where there's an opportunity for them to provide some of the things that you're talking about here. So, you know, I don't think this is always necessarily left up to, you know, the infrastructure of the highway system or rest stops or those kind of things. And what we find is as we educate and promote more what we call shipper of choice and what actually qualifies a shipper of choice, and it's those things that you're talking about, you know, regarding appropriate facilities, you know, adequate parking, you know, a clear entry to the actual facility and understanding where to go and where to park. So, you know, I think that's just something for consideration as we continue to talk about the parking and the challenges that exist there. There is opportunity, I think, to engage those private businesses and warehouses and so on and so forth to have more understanding that their engagement and support for something like this will help them as well long-term.
Can I follow up? Just, I mean, is it your experience, as Mr. Crawford said, you know, there are sometimes multiples of shipments that are available and not the available resource to take on that load. Is this having an effect where, you know, transport company is going to look at just what you said as one of the things? If I'm only going to take my capacity, I'm going to take it in these shippers of choice.
Absolutely. And it goes back, and again, to what Todd mentioned earlier, it goes back to retention, and it goes back to trying to keep our drivers. We don't want to put the drivers in a situation where they're going to be uncertain about all these things largely that are built around safety. And if we know, and we have customers today who understand that importance, we've chosen to partner with them because they understand what shipper of choice is, and they actually are trying to conform to that. But not everybody, that's a very small percentage, I would say, today of shippers that actually want to commit to that shipper of choice approach. So.
One of the other areas is the trucks are stopping and parking for is their federally mandated 30-minute break. After so many hours, through the hours of service, they have to stop, and so they're looking to park at those places. The other one that's a little less easy to plan for is those emergency stops. And those are really if roads closed for weather. The snowstorm we had last week was kind of a good example of trucks were trying to figure out where to park, and maybe they had hours left, but it wasn't safe to get on the road because there was ice everywhere. Crashes, secondary crashes, things like that, or these one other area that truck parking happens that really is a lot less able to plan. You can make some educated guesses, but you're still never going to get them right. And in many areas, time off is the fifth one that's the truck parking. So if they're a independent driver and they take their truck home with them, many municipalities, many regions now have it, can't park it in my subdivision, can't park it on my street. So they are seeking somewhere to put their truck at when they're actually home with their family.
Cheryl, just on the emergency side, I wonder if we couldn't look a little bit at this, because you mentioned the storm last week. We have requirements in place, and they're federal requirements, I know, but even if we look at this on a recommendation basis, because we have a lot of expertise from the trucking industry, we have these issues in place for safety reasons. And then during an emergency like a weather event, all of these end up presenting more as a disincentive for safe behavior. Because, and you have shipping companies that are on, low margin, you have drivers that are under requirements. There isn't probably a driver, because of these safety requirements, that doesn't feel they need to keep rolling while they have hours available. And I would like to think that we could have some mechanism in place from a public sector side where we could alleviate or modify that, because the best, we always find in our icing and snow events that we end up with freight semis that are in incidents, and they're driving where it's not safe to drive. But I think it's because of the disincentive, and the whole point of these other things are for safety. And we don't recognize that we're subjecting people to safety issues by not being a little more flexible here during weather events, during emergencies. And that creates a massive economic issue for the entire state. You close an interstate down. We were very fortunate in the past week where passenger traffic was way down. People heeded the warning. And I know that the folks in the trucking industry are sensible and trying to do everything. I believe it's headlong. We've got a perverse incentive system going on that needs to be able to flip on and off based on the conditions to some extent. And I don't see any movement in that direction. I'd love to be able to work to find one, because we want to keep the truckers safe. We want to keep the interstates open. We want to make sure that there are some flexibilities built in on hours. It might be better for someone and safer in the trucking industry to drive another hour to get out of harm's way, but they have to keep going, or they have to stop, and they stop, and then you're going to be stopped for a day and a half because of the weather that's coming. it doesn't make sense to me. And I think we can do a lot better than what we're doing right now.
I concur with you. I would venture a guess that before the electronic logs were in place, that we saw a lot of drivers doing that. And now the electronic logs have really taken that flexibility out of the driver's hands to be able to handle that. So. Truck parking in Missouri. Jason's Law, which I mentioned earlier, does a survey and collects data from all 50 states and the territories. It says, what do you got of available parking? What do we have? Across the board, everybody has too little parking. Nobody has parking in place. If you see here, Missouri has over 10,000 spaces. Based on the volume of trucks in our state, frankly, that is minimal. MoDOT owns about 1,100 of those, and privately owned spaces have about 9,000, so about 90-10 split on that. Of ours, what you saw with MoDOT was we have spaces with the restroom or a vault toilet. We've done some of that just to make sure that we can provide more parking anywhere we have excess real estate at. And then we have some places that we don't have a lot of slots, about 140 that have no services whatsoever, but you can safely pull off. And so we do get use of those as well. We did a truck parking inventory as part of this project. And what you see here is our map showing there are 141 locations upon our interstates where you can have truck parking, whether it's at a private spot or a public spot. The larger the dot, the more spaces that exist. But we want to look a little deeper into our publicly owned spaces here. And on this, you're seeing that our parking is located at our rest areas, which many of you travel have seen. They're located at our welcome centers. They're located, some parking is at way stations, which is a little controversial in some areas of whether truckers actually want to park there. They feel there is some implication of excess inspections and delay if they do so. And there's truck parking only sites. These were things that were typically prior rest areas, way stations, and we converted those. We shut them down for some reason, a lot of times because of septic systems or environmental reasons. Instead of just shuttering them like we've seen in other parts of the country, we actually worked with the truck driving industry, figured out a way that, hey, if we just provide you a good, safe spot to park, maybe put in vault toilets, which we've borrowed from the conservations, what they use in state parks. It's not going to be fancy, but it's going to be safe off the road. And the truckers were like, yeah, I think we actually worked with Todd's group a lot on that. And
We don't borrow those and give them back. We actually, we borrowed the concept. Yeah,
okay,
thanks.
you insist. But we've kind of hit the spot. We've done all the low-hanging fruit that was on those locations. However,
Cheryl, I'm sorry.
yeah, go ahead.
How do we rank, how do we stack up on publicly owned parking compared? I mean, Missouri's a big state, obviously, so it's hard to compare with a smaller state that's more dense, but how do we stack up?
As far as truck parking availability, we are probably maybe average, maybe a little bit more. I think what we hear from the industry and why we're asked to speak often on truck parking in Missouri, I've been out in Baltimore and spoke to the I-95 corridor before. I've been in California and spoke to them at different conferences. They like the fact that we have done as much as we can and are innovative in trying to squeeze every spot we can out of places. So I haven't looked at the actual numbers versus numbers for how we are in states, but I know that our reputation is we are trying to do things, and that has been beneficial. The industry has always applauded the fact that we are continuing to add spots where we saw 2, 3, 4 years ago when Money Crunch came in, a lot of states actually closed their rest areas. They just put barriers across them and nobody could park. When we get to those places, we didn't barrier them off. We either kept them open or we moved them off and made them all truck parking.
Yeah, and one of the things we are doing we're trying to work through the budget, but we're looking at some of those former rest areas where we only utilized what the existing truck parking was. We didn't pen it off and make it not available, but there still may be some capacity there. So we're looking at what the, it looks to be an average of about $1.5 million each time we do that, a little bit more to try to grab even a little bit more real estate. And we hope to be able to make some progress in the next couple of years. I see Todd has his hand up. First time I caught you, Todd.
Hey, I want to acknowledge the department and appreciate their support and their interest and I guess really taking this interest to heart. As 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 it was mentioned just a little bit earlier, we some years back, whenever Missouri was converting their way stations to the more modern ones, the one just east of our office here is Odessa, and immediately we were curious what they were going to do with the old way station, and we were initially told that they were going to simply just put it back to grass, and seemed like a heck of a waste. So we said, wait a minute, let's see if we can do better than that. And initially, our organization basically adopted that rest area, and we provided trash cans and all of us here in the office went down and did trash pickup periodically. And then after a while, the state said, we'll take care of this stuff. And we appreciated that. But again, I give high marks to the state. Having said that, truckers would prefer parking at truck stops. We in the past have been supportive of incentives for truck stops to basically expand and make more of their parking available. Now that's easier said than done because in so many instances, truck stops end up with facing the same NIMBY syndrome that is, far too common and unfortunate. But those areas that can be expanded and again, some of the existing spots I think could be fairly easily expanded without tremendous expense. We certainly would love to see that happen. And I guess that's really all. And again, I want to acknowledge what the department has done in the past and go forward. And please, if you would, we should make it clear in Missouri way stations that truck parking is permitted, and do all we can basically to dispel any myths that you will be treated. You'll face the heavy hand of government if you go to sleep here, because we want to do just the opposite.
Yeah, the issue is really safety, and making sure that we're welcoming to the industry, particularly with the requirements for the safety layovers and things. So, Thank you, Cheryl.
We have actually done some partnering with Kentucky Transportation Cabinet. I work with their staff pretty frequently, and they were having some of the same issues related to way station parking as we were. They've developed some signs and some public education campaigns through the trucking industry that they're seeing some success with. So this slide is really talking about, out of those 141 spaces or 141 sites, 110 of those are too small. They are, we have 100% plus usage at 87 of those, and 23 of them are 80 approaching 100 existing. So this is based on the data we had. We did purchase some data as well from ATRI, and they're the ones who helped us identify where these spots were, what was going on, and what we could do about them in that capacity. So we have a truck parking problem, and it is somewhere in a partnership, as we've heard the members say. It's not all on the public. It's a public and private issue. And so the public, what we see across other states is the public stepping in places that maybe aren't economically feasible for a truck stop or something along those lines. We just need some spaces. So the public is going in those locations, and the private is really picking up the other part. I had one company tell me that the report we have, when we publish it, will be a gold mine to them because we've identified where the trucks are and where there's not enough parking, and may help prompt some of them to be able to use that. some of the things that are happening in other states that we've seen, and this is one of the things Mary and I talked about. Delaware, I was visiting with some folks up there, and what they told me they did was the city is just close enough to New York City to have a trucking and industry issue, because people stay there instead of going into the city and getting fines. The local government actually purchased a piece of property, and then a truck stop went in and is paying a long-term lease or rent upon that for their truck parking, because the cost of the underlying land was so much that it made it cost prohibitive for private, but when they partnered together, it was available. This is trucks parked. So what happens? We don't have enough truck parking. So where do they go? Oh, they can't violate their electric log hours. They have to stop. They can't find a place to do it. They can't miss their delivery and their pickup. So where do they park? Easiest place to find oftentimes is the interstate right-of-way, which, as we've already said, is not very safe. We find them parked also in shopping centers, on shoulders, ramps, and on interstates. And I want to clarify, make sure you understand, our truck study was really a minimal one just to get us started there, and it only looked at our interstates. We did not go into any other part of the state. So the Route 60 we saw a while ago, I know we don't have any truck parking on that, but we have no data on that either. As you see here, the time that we're seeing people on the interstate right-of-way is 5 to 6 o'clock in the morning, which indicates to us probably that some of that staging that we were talking about earlier, because at our other spots that are permanent spots that are marked, that are approved for that, peak time is 2 to 3 a.m., which is really when people are there for a much longer time. This is the primary network that you saw at our last meeting, and Katie had in her presentation this morning. There is only public designated parking on our interstates only, and we don't have data, as I said, on the others. We know they're stopping, we just don't know where they're stopping on 60s. This map overlays the available parking with a snapshot taken of the trucks parked on the interstate. So what you see is heavily concentrated areas where we would expect, near urban areas, because there's really not any truck parking provided inside the urbanized areas, and you're seeing then that a lot more of this interstate right-of-way parking is taking place inside there as they're staging. This is the gap for public and private to fill, to keep it safe for the drivers and the public, and to secure cargo. This is a closer look at those public sites. Red means that it's more than 100% utilized, and green would mean it's a good spot. There's just not enough green dots on there. We don't have enough. As part of our truck parking study, we did an analysis similar to what you see on this slide of every public parking slot that MoDOT has. We looked at when are they used, how are they used. It talks about how many spots there are and what amenities are at each one. This data will hopefully help us develop some resource allocation and focus some targets into either discretionary grant applications or other resources that become available. This is the final slide, but I want to do kind of a little bit of a knowledge transfer. Everybody's kind of alluded to it, but frankly, truck drivers are only have very little part in the decision of where to park their trucks. Everybody here, the principal agent, the truck driving company, the receiver, the parking provider, infrastructure, regulatory, and other public entities all have a say in where you're going to see those trucks parked at. Programs such as Dustin spoke about a few minutes earlier, where they're incentivizing companies, making sure that they have parking for the folks who are waiting to load and unload, is one of the ways that one of the influences that can be made and done to solve some of these issues that we are seeing. So that is the rest of my presentation, and if you have any questions, I am happy to answer them.
Any questions for Cheryl? Great.
Okay.
I guess you answered them as we were going, so.
Hey, yeah, I'm good, thanks.
Thank you, Cheryl. Appreciate it. Next up, we have Jeff Davis from BNSF Rail Line, and he's going to talk a little bit about the economic incentives in the supply chain. Jeff, really appreciate you being here today. Thank you for sitting through a dense set of presentations. Interesting, but a lot of meaty topics that we're going through, and it's taking us some time to get through them. But again, appreciate you being here, and I'll hand the floor over to you.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So just to echo, a lot of what has already been said here today in terms of, workforce. I share Mr. Crawford's concerns, about the litigation environment in the state. Literally, I just got a message about another issue that, we're facing here in Missouri, right here in this meeting. And, every one of those cases involving our railroad is often millions. It could, there's millions, if not tens of millions of dollars on the line when those cases get brought. Another thing on the workforce development side, we have a program designed especially to recruit veterans. And part of that reason, we love veterans for a whole variety of reasons, but we make an active effort to recruit them. One of the biggest problems that we have now is, we need a drug-free workforce. And that is a huge problem. And so that's just one of the many reasons why we love veterans, but obviously it's getting harder and harder in this day and age. So real quick, I'll get started. Just a little bit about BNSF. We're the railroad that is owned by Berkshire Hathaway, Warren Buffett, everything west of the Mississippi, and we also have a route that goes through Memphis and Birmingham. So we're in 28 states, 3 Canadian provinces. We have 26 intermodal facilities, 35,000 plus employees, 32,500 miles of track. Approximately 3,350 of those employees are here in the state of Missouri. So more than 10% of our workforce is here in Missouri. Over 7,000 locomotives. 2020, we shipped 9.4 million carloads. We have 415 transport facilities. We serve 40 plus ports. We've invested more than $40 billion in our network since 2010. We are part of the supply chain.
I'd just like to stop you on that point alone, because a lot of what we talk about in the public-private piece here, I think that's a unique aspect of rail.
Yes.
And it certainly happens in other modes as well, but that is a stunning figure that is being invested in our, this is a private enterprise, but it's part of our nation's infrastructure, and $40 billion from one company just since 2010.
Yes.
It's amazing.
So this is kind of an overview of the United States. I didn't have a good map of Missouri per se, but just BNSF, we have more than 1,400 miles of track in this state. I mentioned earlier that we have over 3,300 employees. Average just payroll on those employees, not counting benefits, is approximately $80,000 a year. We have rail yards in Brookfield, Cape Girardeau, Kansas City, St. Joseph, St. Louis, Springfield, and West Quincy. Plus, we have an intermodal facility in St. Louis. I don't have the exact numbers for 2021 yet, but we originated approximately 100,000 carloads of freight in Missouri last year. We terminated another 300,000 carloads. And perhaps most importantly, we moved about 5 million carloads through the state of Missouri last year. In terms of our overall volume, just about, 10 million containers moved in 2021. 5.75 million of those containers were consumer products. Another 2.4 million were industrial projects. Ag is still about 10% of our business, 1 million carloads shipped. Talking about our Missouri-specific investment. We do own our own network. Over the last 5 years, we have invested more than $870 million to maintain and improve our network in Missouri. We also pay property taxes. BNSF is one of the largest property taxpayers and funders of public education in Missouri. When you add what we have paid in property taxes to our capital spend over the last 5 years, we've invested more than $1 billion in Missouri.
Hey, Jeff. What happened in 2019 to double the investment?
Flooding, St. Joe, so we had some pretty significant infrastructure challenges that I think MoDOT and others faced too. So just to talk a little bit about economic development with BNSF, we have our own economic development team. They have a combined 350-plus years of experience in the industry. We've helped more than 100 shippers grow their businesses each year. This is an up-to-date map. As you can see, our economic development team, they often cover more than one state. And what we do primarily is we work with the site locators, with the state, with local economic development officials to help attract businesses. We're familiar with not only the incentives that are offered in Missouri, but other states as well. We have a separate team that's dedicated to intermodal. We have another group that does certified sites. So, we want to offer people, the one-stop shop or as much as we can. I think this is probably one of the more important slides here is about how transportation costs will drive the future of, warehouse and distribution development. Transportation often makes up, more than 50, almost close to 60% of the costs involved in the supply chain. So linking transportation with real estate planning as early as possible, that's what's going to help reduce transportation costs. In terms of co-locating, with BNSF, we want to reduce the number of truck miles driven, reduce the CO2 emissions. We want to make everything as efficient as possible. In terms of, connecting to the rail system, I think it's important to also note that railroads are common carriers. We have an obligation to serve. We file tariffs at the Surface Transportation Board. They have the force and effect of law. So if someone wants to ship grain, if they want to ship grain alcohol, if they want to ship ethanol, there is a separate tariff out there for everything that we haul. Collectively, we spend billions of dollars every year to maintain and enhance our infrastructure, but we don't have the capital to connect new customers or communities or business parks that are seeking that rail service unless we have, a bona fide customer who's there, and even then, we face some significant issues. So, we do work with local and state officials to try to do that. The biggest problem that I see out there is that, how do you get that first or last mile of rail connectivity? I can give an example. Lebanon, Missouri, right now has a business park. It does not have rail service. They are very desirous of having rail service to that business park. They are telling me, hey, we cannot even get site locators to look at us because we don't have rail service. But, that is a hurdle that we have not been able to overcome. So, just a word about one of the tools that we have available here in Missouri, the Freight Enhancement Fund. It's $1 million a year. It's been in the budget since 2014. The maximum grant is $500,000. It requires a 20% local match. We have used this program in the past, but to help put things in perspective, a switch, just a switch can cost $500,000 or more. The switch and signal work together on a recent project, one of my economic development people quoted me a cost of $2.5 million. That doesn't include any track work. So, you know, even if the customer owns the property, it's fairly flat, you don't have any engineering issues that are really significant, your track costs will probably be more than $1 million a mile. So, talking about what is going on in other states, last year, Nebraska passed a Rural Rail Development Act, a Rural Projects Act. They put a one-time appropriation of $10 million out there to develop industrial rail parks. They had $73 million in requests, plus more interest. So this year, they had a new bill filed that would expand those funds available to $50 million. That bill was heard on Tuesday the 8th. No one testified in opposition. I think it's important to help people realize that railroads don't apply for this money, the communities apply for this money. So it's, you know, they're all wanting spurs and access to create these economic development opportunities.
Jeff, do you see this expansion in funding primarily coming out of the one-time ARPA and maybe the bipartisan infrastructure money, or do you see states actually putting money on the table?
In most cases, the big shots of money are coming from the one-time ARPA money and the federal money that is coming down. So, but there are states that are, you know, putting more dollars than we do into the program as well. So just another topic, I mean, there are our neighbor to the west, they're also one of our biggest competitors. Kansas Department of Transportation has $10 million a year in an economic development fund designed for transportation investments to recruit new businesses and encourage growth of existing businesses. That's not exclusive to rail. That's just any kind of DOT project where they need a road or some sort of public infrastructure. That's what that fund is for. In addition, they have a separate rail services improvement fund that's dedicated to improving rail access and preserving the condition of the state's short lines. That program gets $5 million a year for loans and reimbursable grants. Perhaps
If I could,
Sure.
one thing just in comparison, and, you know, to say that freight enhancement fund is paltry, admittedly, for the state, for a state that has so much rail freight and investment in the state. We do have here at the Missouri Highway and Transportation Commission reinstated a cost share program a few years ago, and we're building that up to about $45 million a year. Most of that is a 50-50 cost share with local communities, but there is a carve out of about 10% of that money, so it's about $4.5 million a year. That is up to 100% money for these. This would be the type of thing that would be eligible for that type of activity, and we work with the Department of Economic Development. So it's not all bleak. We're trying to get there. It's very challenging to get funding.
So another recent development, in December of this year, Kansas approved another $100 million in grants for economic development projects. This, once again, is the one-time ARPA money. They have this base program, and, you know, it's not limited to rail. It's just, you know, it's economic development projects that are going to create jobs, infrastructure. You know, one of the words that I've heard used is that you know, we are looking for transformative projects. Well, this is a tool that they are using to help, you know, identify and create those transformative projects. And just to close, we really don't seem to have that kind of tool here in Missouri for these transformative projects to help Missouri communities who aren't already connected to the supply chain get connected, and we need one. When I get involved in development opportunities, in most cases, they are looking for a site that is ready to go. Planning and zoning can take 6 to 12 months. And putting in the rail infrastructure can take another 6 to 12 months or longer. And, in the cases that I'm familiar with where literally we had one customer who showed up at the business park, literally the building was 3 months from completion. They said, we need it in 1. And we got it done. So that's my presentation, Mr. Chairman. I'm happy to answer any questions. What can we do to help you?
I like the way you tied that last piece, because the whole time, as you're giving your presentation, what was floating around in my mind was, what's the single biggest and most important thing that we can do as a state to help encourage the type of development that we need? And I think you gave us some good examples of that. And it also points out the lack of those investments here in Missouri. And I think that that's something we all need to think about as we're thinking about recommendations here. The sources of funds in this state are very, very much designated for particular transportation revenues dedicated constitutionally for certain purposes. But that can equate on a public policy basis to, we're taking care of infrastructure, when it's not really doing the job on the entire multimodal network. And the states, even those that are directly around us, that are providing those investments and creating those opportunities, in light of what we're hearing about with the projected growth in freight movement, I don't view this as a competitive issue. I view this as it's almost like, in many ways, we have to be all in on all modes to even be competitive in the coming years, and to be a place where businesses can thrive.
Trucking is almost 60% of our business.
Right.
So from the time, we're not shipping it direct to stores. We are handing it off to someone else.
Right.
And so we are all in this together, and it's going to take a lot of cooperation, and there's no magic solution that's going to fix all of these problems.
Right.
To that note, can you talk a little bit more about, as a freight forwarder, I would be remiss if I didn't voice frustrations of the connectivity going in and out of the state of Missouri for BCOs. So for instance, we have discussed this since March of 2020, where we saw this decline in being able to book ocean freight. So I know the rail and the steamship lines have contracts and they service. So the rail steamship line will give us, a freight forwarder, a rate from St. Louis, Missouri to Taiwan. Well, the rail is typically that first leg of the shipment, right? All the way out to the east or west coast or Southport. And what we're starting to see is the steamship lines will say, oh, well, we don't have any bookings to give you. And a lot of the times Missouri agriculture suffers the most on an export side of things, because they rely so heavily on the margins that the rail industry is such a huge partner to agriculture, because it really is the most economic way for them to transport the goods out to an ocean-going port. But what we've seen is the steamship lines saying, well, due to there's lack of containers in Missouri, therefore we won't get the booking because they can't fulfill a rail service. Like, I would just love to hear your perspective of it, because if you talk to the steamship lines, they say it's the rail's fault. If you talk to, I've spoken to a few people at Union Pacific, and they say, well, no, it's the steamship line's fault. And I just think for the general public, it would be good to know how the rail and the steamship lines work together And then we can kind of peel down a bigger layer of the onion on why it's really affecting Missouri companies so much on import and export.
Right. I think it would be best for me to get someone else to come in who, can respond to you. I will say that BNSF has a grain ombudsman who is from Missouri, who, her job, her responsibility is to work with our elevators, work with our end-use customers. I mean, as, a lot of grain obviously gets shipped from elevators. They're on the river. So I'm not aware of us trucking a lot of grain in Missouri or shipping a lot of grain in Missouri like we would in other western states, for instance, Kansas, which, wheat, corn in Nebraska, et cetera. But I can, if you have numerous hearings and I can get somebody to come back at a later date and,
love
and
that.
respond to that.
That would be great.
Go ahead, Jeff. Jeff, I was just gonna say, I appreciate you also putting this context of kind of the economic development landscapes. I think so often we forget about the obvious when we think about economic development, and you and I had a chance to connect. And the investments that we're making to, whether it's on the workforce side or it's incentives to attract new industry, I think it does come back to communities don't have the support they need, especially rural communities. But, honestly, it's an urban-rural, they both have the problem making these sorts of investments. So by laying out what other states are doing, how they're going to use these dollars for true transformative efforts, but tying it back to this is an economic development investment, I think is important for us to remember. It's easy to think that infrastructure is transportation and forget sometimes, I think, that it comes back to economic development, which comes back to everything else we do. So appreciate you putting in that context.
Well, and at some point, obviously, in the urban areas, we're having to move further and further out because everything that's close is taken. And particularly when you have a customer that's, maybe it may not be a mega site, but maybe they want a larger site than one that's available, we're having to go further out to help find those locations.
I was just going to comment, Jeff, one item you brought up, and it's absolutely spot on, is that, when you think about rail and trucking, they go hand in hand. And there's definitely, in at least what I've seen, there's no competitiveness between the two because one can't go without the other, truly. And whether it's, even in past lives, I can think about some of the most successful business ventures we had was by a strong partnership with the rail and then going in collaboratively with customers and then selling customers on the opportunity that they could provide with the carrier as well as the rail provider together in the room. So I just think as we move forward, and I hear a lot too today, we don't particularly participate a lot in any drayage or work with the rail at the moment, but I do know from customers we deal with who ship intermodal and use the rail system, one of the biggest challenges they have today is that gap in getting to and from the actual hub. And, obviously that's an impact and challenge that creates for, the rail provider as well. So I do think that there's absolutely something there more that should and could be done to help with that piece. So, anyway.
Thank you.
One more quick question. I love that you talked about the development, and especially in rural areas and the demand for it, specifically Lebanon. When you guys are looking at when they're discussing it, is the subject of environmental ever brought up? Like, I know that there's some really innovative technologies that are, actually one is a Missouri company, EverTrack, and they make rail ties out of recycled plastics that they're selling by the truckload to Canada. And so I'm just curious, like, are those things ever brought up, like when there is a new site?
Well, absolutely, because, one of the things that people want to know is it a brown field or is it not? Are there, everybody's analyzing, I mean, people are investing tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars in capital. They want to know, what the environmental issues are, as well as we have customers that, are looking to reduce their carbon footprint, every way possible if they can't eliminate it or offset it. So, by locating it, where there's as little drayage as possible, then, we're certainly trying to minimize all of those costs.
Great.
Well, terrific presentation. Really appreciate what you do in the state of Missouri as a company and as a representative of the industry. So thank you very much for being here. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Mr. Director.
Yes. We have, and I just wanted to check, we have not, I would say, as a task force, really made highly convenient the public comment part of this. And again, some of that is just the logistics of dealing with it. I know we had some comments that were submitted in writing. Do we have any members of the public that wish to make any comments before us today? Nope. Okay, seeing none. One of the challenges of, laying out whether we can do comments virtually or not is one thing. Did we have some written comments that came in from the public as well? I think we were anticipating some if we didn't receive them. I want to make everybody aware that we'll put those on our website so that at a minimum, we'll have public comments that will be incorporated into a section of the report. We need to probably work on the website a little bit to make more convenient the ability to feed comments in so that the task force can draw those out. And we do anticipate, as we travel around a little bit, that we'll draw some more of those in as well. I think that's an important part of what we're trying to do is draw that out. We're hearing from a lot of stakeholders, and we want to make sure we're hearing directly from the public also. And we want to make that convenient. We're in a limited window we're in a limited window of time to generate a report, but I think we could probably even extend the window for comments as we're developing that. And that is probably what will generate a lot of those comments is, drafting of the report and otherwise. But I don't know how other members feel about that, how you'd like to see that done.
Maybe I would just comment, on our, one way is there's a lot of experts out there. So maybe a call for white papers, we could have it run, synchronized with the meeting, have a deadline where we collect those. And then, my team's had to do this a lot, so we can help out. We're really good at synthesizing a lot of information. Using the Best of Midwest portal, we also have any time someone can upload a white paper or add a comment. So I think we could either use that or create that on this task force slide. But I think that's a good opportunity sometimes, especially through white papers, because there's a lot of great people who have a lot of great ideas who could submit some things that we can then consider and use as appendices in our final report.
I will take you up immediately on that offer. I think that's terrific. It's a great suggestion. And utilizing, sorry, Logan's got some work to do. Megan. Boy, this is a real banner day for you, Megan. I bet we won't see you in this building again, right? So,
I think we'll give her Friday off.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. But if we could utilize the portal that exists when doing a call for white papers related to the subject matter, that would be a help for us and my IT team here. So I love that. We could put a link. I would imagine we could put a link on our website and forward that over. And if you want to refine or anything, maybe we can work offline to determine what that call for white papers looks like, if we want to do them in certain topical areas or just do a broad-based one. I think that's a great idea. Thank you. Any other comments, feedback? Mary, give you an opportunity. You're okay? Good. 3 hours, and here we are in a public building, no lunch. So I'm sure everybody's hungry and tired and wants to get on the road. I appreciate, again, all the task force members for your time and for your work, and certainly the MoDOT team. I want to say thank you to all that gave presentations today. They were highly informative and central to the topics at hand. Special thanks to Katie Kirk with Cambridge Systematics for not only your work in the presentation today, but for your ongoing work helping the task force as well as helping the department. And with that, unless there are any other, Marty?
Just a couple logistics things
Sure.
for this group. Just a reminder that, as we're thinking about legislation, things like that, the March 1st deadline is coming up. So again, the purpose of a lot of what we're doing is putting a solid foundation for what will come next after, this legislative session. But, it's an annual cycle for those that follow that, so we'll definitely be willing. And then the other thing is, there's a note here from, we're in Springfield next week, but there's also a bit of a snow opportunity. So, under safety, we do have the WebEx option. So for those that have a hard time traveling, that's an option as well. So with that, I think we can make decisions.
Yeah, it's a good point. Once we get a tighter forecast a couple days out, we may have to pivot the way that we're doing this. Hopefully not. Hopefully we can retain that location. I believe the airport's been gracious enough to host us. So hopefully we can make that happen. Any other business? Thanks, everybody. No gavel, but appreciate everybody's time. There we go. And we'll see everybody next week. It'll come fast, believe me. All right. Thank you.
Can you send them in? There you go. Sweet.